You don't belong here. The words sliced through the marble lobby at 11:47 p.m., cold and final. Alyssa Grant stood motionless as the night manager ground her credit card beneath his polished shoe, the plastic splintering like her supposed credibility. Guests circled with phones raised, capturing her humiliation in real time. Laughter rippled through the crowd as security moved toward her worn sneakers and faded jeans. But Alyssa wasn't checking for exits. She was checking her watch. In 13 minutes, she was due on a conference call worth $300 million. In 13 minutes, this luxury hotel, this gleaming monument to exclusivity, would discover exactly who they'd just thrown out. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Time would speak for her. If you're drawn to stories where dignity defeats arrogance and justice arrives not with a shout, but with undeniable truth, stay with me until the very end. Like and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The Grandeur Hotel stood like a crystal fortress against the Chicago skyline, its limestone facade polished to aristocratic perfection. Revolving doors whispered open for guests draped in cashmere and confidence, their designer luggage gliding across floors that reflected chandeliers worth more than most mortgages. This was a temple of exclusivity, where bellhops memorized surnames and concierges anticipated needs before they were spoken. At 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday in October, the lobby hummed with the quiet efficiency of wealth until Alyssa Grant walked through those doors. She moved with purpose but not performance, her canvas sneakers squeaking faintly against marble that had never felt such humble tread. Her jeans were clean but faded at the knees, her jacket practical rather than fashionable. A single canvas messenger bag hung from her shoulder, the kind students carried to libraries. She didn't scan the room for admiration or acknowledgement. She simply approached the front desk with the weary determination of someone who'd been traveling for 16 hours and wanted nothing more than a bed. Behind the reception counter, Marcus Chen had been night manager for 3 years. He'd cultivated an image of himself as guardian of standards, protector of the hotel's reputation. His suit was immaculate, his posture military straight, his eyes trained to assess worth in the first 3 seconds of visual contact. When those eyes landed on Alyssa, his expression hardened into something between suspicion and disgust. "Can I help you?" The question emerged not as hospitality, but as challenge. Alyssa set her bag on the counter, fatigue evident in the careful way she moved. "I have a reservation. Grant. Alyssa Grant." Marcus didn't touch his computer. "You have a reservation. Here." "Yes. Confirmed 3 days ago. Penthouse suite." A sound escaped his throat. Not quite a laugh, but close. "The penthouse. Of course." He finally tapped his keyboard, each keystroke deliberate and theatrical. "I'm not seeing any reservation under that name." "Check again, please. Confirmation number B77294. His fingers didn't move. "Ma'am, I don't need to check again. We don't have walk-ins for the penthouse. That suite is reserved months in advance by clientele who—" He paused, letting his gaze travel pointedly from her scuffed sneakers to her makeup-free face. "Clientele who belong here." The words hung in the air like smoke. At a nearby cluster of leather chairs, 2 women in evening gowns paused their conversation, sensing drama. A businessman at the bar swiveled slightly on his stool. The lobby's ambient music, something instrumental and forgettable, seemed to fade beneath the weight of Marcus's implication. Alyssa's voice remained level. "I understand you're busy. If you could just verify the reservation, I've had a very long day." "I'm sure you have." Marcus leaned forward, lowering his voice to a register that pretended at confidentiality while carrying perfectly to nearby ears. "But I'm going to need to see some identification and a valid credit card before we continue this conversation." She reached into her bag without protest, extracting her driver's license and a credit card. Marcus accepted them as though they might contaminate his fingers, holding the license at arm's length. "This doesn't look like you. It's 3 years old. The address doesn't match our records." "I've moved since then. The reservation was made with my current contact information." He set the license down with exaggerated care, then examined the credit card as if it were a suspect artifact. "This card." He tapped it against the marble. "This looks suspicious. We've had problems with fraud recently." Alyssa's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That card is valid. Run it." Oh, I intend to. But instead of swiping the card, Marcus raised his voice, projecting now for the growing audience. Sarah, could you call security, please? The desk clerk beside him, a young woman who'd been pretending to organize papers, startled. Security? Mr. Chen, I can just verify the... Security. Now. Sarah's hand hovered over the phone, her eyes darting between her manager and the woman whose exhaustion was beginning to show cracks in her composure. Are you sure that's... Are you questioning me? Marcus's tone could have frozen water. Call them. The lobby had shifted. What had been ambient attention was now focused observation. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Phones emerged from pockets and purses, angling toward the unfolding scene. The businessman at the bar leaned back, settling in for entertainment. The women in evening gowns whispered behind manicured hands, their expressions mixing curiosity with barely concealed satisfaction, the particular pleasure that comes from watching someone else's humiliation from a safe distance. Alyssa placed both palms flat on the counter, her voice dropping to something quiet and dangerous. There's no need for security. Just check your system. The reservation exists. Marcus picked up her credit card, holding it between thumb and forefinger as if displaying evidence. This card, he announced to the room as much as to her, is clearly fraudulent. The grandeur doesn't accept... He made a show of reading it. Cards from regional banks used by people trying to appear as something they're not. That's a legitimate... Ma'am. He cut her off, his voice rising with performative authority. I've been in hospitality for 15 years. I know what fraud looks like. I know what belongs here and what doesn't. His gaze traveled across her again, slower this time, ensuring everyone caught his meaning. And you don't belong here. The words detonated in the marble silence. Sarah inhaled sharply. A guest near the elevator gasped. Someone's phone chimed as a live stream notification went out, but Alyssa didn't flinch. She simply checked her watch, 11:51 p.m. And when she looked back up, something in her eyes had changed. Not anger, something colder, something patient. I suggest, she said quietly, you reconsider what you're about to do. Marcus smiled, the kind of smile that had probably intimidated countless service workers and junior staff. Is that a threat? Because threatening hotel staff is grounds for police involvement. He raised his voice again. Where's security? Right here, Mr. Chen. 2 security guards emerged from a side corridor, their bulk and uniforms designed to intimidate. The taller one, whose name tag read Jenkins, surveyed the scene with professional assessment. What's the situation? This woman is attempting to use a fraudulent credit card to book the penthouse suite. She's been aggressive and threatening. I need her escorted from the property. Jenkins looked at Alyssa, taking in her appearance, her composure, the way she stood completely still while the lobby watched. Ma'am, is that true? No, I have a confirmed reservation. The card is legitimate. This is a misunderstanding that can be resolved by checking the computer system. Marcus interrupted before Jenkins could respond. She's lying. There's no reservation. I've checked. You didn't check, Alyssa said, her voice still eerily calm. You saw what I was wearing and decided I didn't belong before you looked at any computer. That's a serious accusation. Marcus's face flushed. I treat every guest with equal, then treat me as a guest. Check. The system. The lobby had gone completely silent. Phones were definitely recording now, multiple angles capturing the standoff, the security guards flanking an exhausted woman in worn jeans, the impeccably dressed manager defending his territory. At the bar, someone muttered, "This is going viral." The women in evening gowns had their phones out too, no longer pretending discretion. Jenkins, to his credit, seemed uncomfortable. Mr. Chen, maybe we should just verify. I don't need to verify anything. Marcus snatched Alyssa's credit card and, in a gesture that would be replayed millions of times across social media within hours, dropped it on the floor and ground it beneath his shoe. The plastic splintered with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. There. That's what I think of your fraud. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Sarah covered her mouth. Even Jenkins took a step back, shock breaking through his professional mask. But Alyssa didn't react to the destroyed card. She was checking her watch again. 11:53 p.m. You just destroyed my property, she said, her voice carrying now clear and cold. in front of approximately 30 witnesses and at least 7 recording devices. Marcus laughed, an ugly, triumphant sound. Sue me, but first get out of my hotel before I have you arrested for trespassing and attempted fraud. Your hotel? Alyssa repeated the words as if testing their weight. Interesting choice of words. That's right. My hotel, my lobby, my rules. And you, he jabbed a finger toward the door, are not welcome here. The crowd shifted, some people nodding in approval, others looking uncertain. The businessman at the bar raised his glass in a mock toast. One of the evening gown women said, loud enough to carry, "Finally, someone who maintains standards." But Sarah, the desk clerk, had gone pale, her eyes fixed on something on her computer screen. "Mr. Chen," she whispered urgently. "Mr. Chen, I think you should—" "Not now, Sarah." "But the system is showing—" "I said not now." He turned back to Jenkins. "Remove her, immediately." Jenkins reached toward Alyssa's arm, but she shifted slightly, not resisting, but not yielding. "I'm going to give you one more opportunity to resolve this professionally," she said, and now there was something new in her voice. Not anger, not pleading, but the absolute certainty of someone who held every card and was simply waiting for others to realize it. "Check your corporate directory, check your ownership records, and then we can all move forward from this moment with whatever dignity can still be salvaged." Corporate directory. Marcus's laugh was vicious now. "Lady, I don't care if you're the president. You're dressed like you can't afford a Motel 6. You're trying to scam your way into our most expensive suite, and you're refusing to leave when asked. That's 3 crimes. Jenkins, wait." Sarah's voice cracked with urgency. She'd been typing frantically, her face growing paler with each keystroke. "Mr. Chen, please, I really think you need to—" "Sarah, so help me. If you don't stop interrupting, the reservation is real." The words exploded from her, loud enough that everyone in the lobby heard. "There's a reservation for Alyssa Grant, penthouse suite, confirmed 3 days ago. And there's a notation, a priority flag, level 9 clearance." The lobby froze. Level 9 clearance was whispered about among hotel staff like folklore, reserved for corporate executives, diplomats, celebrities who needed complete discretion. No one in the building had authority to cancel a level 9 reservation. Barely anyone had clearance to view the details. Marcus's smile faltered. "That's impossible. Give me that screen." He shouldered Sarah aside, jabbing at the keyboard. The confidence drained from his face in real time, replaced by confusion, then concern, then something approaching fear. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly. His hand, still on the mouse, began to tremble. Alyssa checked her watch. 11:55 p.m. "Find what you're looking for?" "This must be a system error, a glitch. There's no way." But his voice lacked conviction now, the words unraveling even as he spoke them. "Mr. Chen." Alyssa's voice cut through his spiral with surgical precision. "In 5 minutes, I have a conference call with our European development partners. $300 million in expansion contracts. I flew 16 hours to be here for that call because the penthouse has secure communications equipment I need. You've now cost me 8 minutes of preparation time, destroyed my credit card, and created a public spectacle that is currently being broadcast to approximately—" She glanced at the nearest phone, noting the viewer count on a live stream. 43,000 people. The blood drained from Marcus's face. "European development partners? Our?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Mr. Chen, look at the notation field, the ownership percentage." He looked, and the last of his arrogance collapsed like a demolished building. His knees actually buckled slightly, caught only by his grip on the counter. When he spoke again, his voice was hoarse. "That's not possible. You can't be—" 51% majority shareholder, Alyssa said, pulling a leather document holder from her messenger bag, the first expensive item she'd revealed. She opened it with deliberate care, extracting papers and laying them on the counter one by one. "Acquired through Grant Capital Holdings 14 months ago. The transaction was public record. Perhaps you missed the memo." Corporate letterhead gleamed under the chandelier light. Official seals, signatures, each document a nail in Marcus's professional coffin. The lobby had gone so quiet that the sound of paper touching marble was clearly audible. Phones continued recording, but now hands trembled, the reality of what they were witnessing shifting from entertainment to catastrophe. Marcus stared at the documents as if they might transform into something else if he looked long enough. I didn't know. The staff wasn't informed about. The staff received 4 separate communications about the ownership change, Alyssa said, pulling out her phone and tapping the screen. November 3rd, January 17th, March 9th, and August 1st. All mandatory reading, all requiring acknowledgement signatures. She turned the phone to show him. You acknowledged all 4. Your digital signature is time-stamped. His mouth worked soundlessly. Sweat had appeared on his forehead, catching the light. You knew, Alyssa continued, her voice still unnervingly calm. Or you should have known. But knowledge wouldn't have mattered tonight, would it? Because you saw someone in casual clothes and made a decision about their worth in 3 seconds. Just like you've probably done hundreds of times before. Sarah had backed away from the desk, her hand still covering her mouth. Jenkins and his partner had gone rigid, their faces carefully blank. The expression of people desperately trying to avoid being implicated in someone else's disaster. The guests who'd been so entertained moments ago were now silent, some lowering their phones, others maintaining their recording, but with very different energy. The viral moment had shifted from watching someone be humiliated to watching the humiliator realize his mistake in real time. Marcus tried to speak, failed, then tried again. Ms. Grant, I apologize. I made a terrible error in judgment. If you'll just what? Alyssa's voice hardened. Accept your apology and pretend this didn't happen? Pretend you didn't destroy my property, call me a fraud, and have security attempt to remove me from a building I own. Pretend 43,000 people didn't just watch you demonstrate exactly what you think of guests who don't meet your visual standards of wealth. It was a mistake, please. How many other mistakes have you made, Mr. Chen? She gestured to the lobby. How many other people have you treated this way when you thought no one important was watching? How many staff members have you terrorized with the same arrogance you just displayed? He couldn't meet her eyes. The silence stretched, excruciating and complete. Alyssa checked her watch, 11:57 p.m. I have 3 minutes before my call. Sarah, is the penthouse ready? Yes, Ms. Grant. Sarah's voice shook. Absolutely. I'll get you checked in immediately. The secure line is active. Thank you. Alyssa began gathering her documents, her movements unhurried despite the time pressure. Mr. Chen, we'll discuss this further tomorrow, 9 a.m., my suite. Bring your employee file and every performance review you've written in the past 3 years. Of course, absolutely. I'll be there. His relief was palpable and pathetic. Thank you for... Don't thank me. She cut him off, her eyes finally meeting his with an intensity that made him flinch. I haven't decided what happens to you yet. That will depend on what I discover tomorrow. She turned toward the elevators, her worn sneakers squeaking against marble that suddenly seemed far less intimidating. The crowd parted without being asked, phones still recording, but now capturing something entirely different than they'd intended. A woman in an evening gown who'd been laughing minutes ago now looked sick. The businessman at the bar had turned away, suddenly fascinated by his drink. As Alyssa waited for the elevator, Sarah hurried over with a key card. Ms. Grant, I'm so sorry. I tried to tell him. I tried to... I know you did. Alyssa's voice softened fractionally. That won't be forgotten. The elevator dinged, the doors opened. Alyssa stepped inside and turned to face the lobby one final time. Marcus stood frozen behind the desk, his career crumbling around him in real time. The guests stood in awkward clusters, unsure whether to pretend they hadn't witnessed anything or openly discuss the scandal unfolding. The phones continued recording, documenting not revenge but something colder, the moment when assumptions met reality and shattered. One more thing, Alyssa said as the doors began to close. Anyone who shared video of the first part of tonight's incident should probably share what happens next, too. Context matters. The doors closed. The elevator hummed upward. And in the lobby she left behind, chaos erupted. Marcus collapsed into his chair, his head in his hands. Sarah stood paralyzed, unsure whether to call corporate, call security, or simply walk out and never return. Jenkins muttered to his partner, "We're so fired." The guests exploded into frantic conversation, some deleting videos, others uploading frantically, everyone suddenly understanding they'd participated in something that would define their social media presence for months. At the bar, the businessman who'd toasted Marcus's cruelty pulled out his phone and began typing what would become one of the night's most viral tweets. Just watch the Grandeur Hotel night manager destroy a woman's credit card and mock her appearance in front of a crowd. Then watched him discover she owns the hotel. There is a god. One of the evening gown women, her face pale, turned to her companion. "Oh my God, I laughed. People saw me laugh." "Delete your video. Delete it now." "It's already been screen recorded." Someone replied with my name and employer. Across the lobby, conversations spiraled into panic. Those who'd been entertained now faced consequences. Those who'd recorded now discovered their footage was being shared far beyond their control. But now with captions like, "Manager destroys boss's credit card," and "the moment he realized." The story was being rewritten in real time, and everyone present had a role they couldn't escape. Sarah finally reached for the phone with shaking hands. She had to call corporate. She had to call the regional manager. She had to call someone who could possibly contain this disaster. But as she lifted the receiver, she realized there was nothing to contain. The disaster was complete. The owner of their hotel, their majority shareholder, had been publicly humiliated by her own employee. There was no PR strategy for that, no damage control, just consequences, falling like dominoes. Marcus hadn't moved. His breathing had gone shallow and rapid. In 15 years of hospitality, he'd prided himself on maintaining standards, on protecting the hotel from people who didn't belong. He'd built his identity around that vigilance, that certainty. And in 8 minutes, it had all become evidence of exactly what he'd always feared, that his judgment was flawed, his standards arbitrary, his arrogance a liability no organization could afford. The elevator housing Alyssa reached the penthouse. The doors opened onto an elegant foyer that did indeed contain sophisticated telecommunications equipment. She walked to the desk, set down her bag, and pulled out her laptop. 11:59 p.m., 1 minute to spare. As she connected to the secure line, she glanced at her phone. The live streams had multiplied. News outlets were already picking up the story. Her assistant had sent 7 increasingly frantic messages. Her lawyers had sent 3. And somewhere below her, in a lobby she'd walked through 100 times during renovations and acquisitions, a man who'd thought he had power was discovering what it felt like to lose it completely. Alyssa closed her eyes for just a moment, letting the exhaustion she'd been suppressing crash over her. Then she opened them, squared her shoulders, and answered the incoming video call. "Good evening, everyone. Sorry for the slight delay. I had an interesting check-in experience." On the screens before her, executives from London, Paris, and Frankfurt looked confused. "Everything all right?" "It will be," Alyssa said, her voice perfectly steady, perfectly professional. Now, regarding the Budapest property acquisition. Below, the lobby continued its spiral. Security footage was being pulled, statements were being prepared, and in corners and crevices throughout the hotel, staff members who'd witnessed Marcus's reign of small cruelties and arbitrary judgments began to whisper, wondering if this night might finally change something, or if power would simply protect itself as it always had. But up in the penthouse, Alyssa Grant was already thinking past tomorrow's confrontation, past the inevitable terminations and policy changes, to something larger. She'd built a career on seeing value others missed, on betting on potential others dismissed. She'd started with nothing but student loans and a business degree from a state school, wearing secondhand clothes to interviews and eating ramen to save for professional memberships. She remembered every person who'd looked at her the way Marcus had tonight, every interviewer who'd dismissed her credentials, every banker who'd questioned her projections, every consultant who'd underestimated her because she didn't dress or speak or move through the world the way they expected success to look. And she'd spent 15 years proving them wrong, acquiring properties and companies others overlooked, finding value in places the market ignored, building an empire one careful decision at a time. Tonight wasn't about revenge. It was about something she'd promised herself years ago, that when she had power, she'd use it to change systems, not just punish individuals. Tomorrow morning would be interesting, but tonight she had $300 million in contracts to finalize. The world didn't stop for humiliation, yours or anyone else's. It just kept moving, indifferent to who belonged where, caring only about what you built and who you became when no one was watching. She smiled slightly, something cold and determined, and returned her attention to the screens. In the lobby below, Marcus Chen checked his watch and realized his career had probably ended at 11:47 p.m. The moment he'd decided someone in worn sneakers couldn't possibly belong in his perfect hotel. He just hadn't known it yet. Now he knew. And everyone else would too, by morning. The conference call lasted until 2:47 a.m. 3 hours of negotiations conducted in 4 languages, contracts parsed line by line, contingencies debated with the kind of precision that turned millions into legally binding reality. Alyssa's exhaustion had long since moved beyond physical discomfort into something approaching transcendence, that strange clarity that comes when the body surrenders but the mind refuses. When the final signatures were digitally rendered and the screens went dark, she sat motionless for several minutes, listening to the silence of the penthouse and the distant hum of the city beyond bulletproof glass. She should sleep. 4 hours until the meeting with Marcus. 4 hours to rest before dealing with the wreckage downstairs. But sleep felt impossible now, adrenaline and anger forming a cocktail that kept her spine rigid and her thoughts racing. Instead, she opened her laptop and began pulling files. Employee records, guest complaints, financial reports, surveillance footage requests. If tomorrow was going to be a reckoning, it would be a thorough one. The documentation painted a picture she'd suspected but hoped wasn't true. Marcus Chen had been night manager for 3 years, but the problems predated his promotion. Guest complaints about discriminatory service had increased 42% during his tenure. Staff turnover in his shifts ran 60% higher than other departments. There were incident reports buried in HR files, a housekeeper reduced to tears, a valet accused of theft without evidence, a guest of Middle Eastern descent questioned about terrorism because his accent made Marcus uncomfortable. Each incident had been smoothed over, apologized for, contained, never corrected, never addressed systematically, and woven through the documentation was a more insidious pattern. Marcus hadn't acted alone. Other staff members had learned from his example, had absorbed his judgments as policy. The culture he'd cultivated had metastasized, spreading through shift rotations and break room conversations until discrimination became standard practice, disguised as maintaining standards. Alyssa's jaw tightened as she read. This wasn't one bad manager. This was institutional rot. By the time dawn began lightening the Chicago skyline, she'd compiled a presentation that would take far more than one meeting to address. But the meeting with Marcus would be where it started, not with punishment, but with exposure, with forcing everyone involved to see exactly what they'd built while no one was watching. At 6:30 a.m., her phone began buzzing with messages. Her assistant, 12 news outlets requesting comment. Her head of PR, social media analysis attached, were approaching 8 million views. Her legal team, multiple angles to consider before any terminations. Her COO, should I fly to Chicago? She responded to each with the same message. Meeting with involved parties at 9 a.m. Will advise after. Then she showered, dressed in clothes that cost more than Marcus's monthly salary, and prepared for war disguised as a business meeting. At 8:45 a.m., she descended to the lobby. Morning shift was in full operation now, but word had clearly spread overnight. Staff froze when they saw her, conversations dying mid-sentence. A bellhop actually dropped a suitcase. The morning manager, a woman named Patricia who'd been with the hotel for 12 years, approached with the careful movements of someone navigating a minefield. Ms. Grant, good morning. I want to apologize on behalf of... Is the conference room prepared? Yes, ma'am. Conference room 3. Coffee and pastries are... Just coffee. And I'll need access to the hotel's main server for the presentation display. Patricia's eyes widened slightly. The main server? That would show... everything. Yes. Alyssa met her gaze steadily. That's the point. Make sure it has it configured by 9. Of course. Right away. Patricia hurried off, already pulling out her phone. Alyssa walked through the lobby she'd been thrown out of 9 hours earlier. The marble still gleamed, the chandeliers still sparkled. But now staff members pressed themselves against walls as she passed, their faces pale with uncertainty. Some looked guilty. Others looked terrified. A few looked hopeful, as if her presence might finally mean something would change. In the lobby's center where Marcus had ground her credit card under his shoe, there was nothing. No mark, no evidence, no trace that anything had happened. The hotel's impeccable maintenance had erased the physical evidence within hours. But phones had preserved what mattered. Memory had preserved what mattered. And Alyssa was about to make sure no one forgot. Conference Room 3 was elegant and intimidating, designed for corporate negotiations and high-stakes decisions. When Alyssa entered at 8:55, she found it already occupied. Marcus sat at the far end of the table, looking like he hadn't slept. His suit was fresh, but his face was haggard, shadows under his eyes dark as bruises. Beside him sat two other night shift employees, Sarah, the desk clerk who'd tried to warn him, and Jenkins, the security guard who'd been called to remove her. Standing near the windows were three people Alyssa hadn't summoned: Patricia, the HR director named Robert Halstead, and the hotel's general manager, David Brennan. Brennan looked deeply uncomfortable, his expensive suit unable to hide the tension in his shoulders. "Ms. Grant," Brennan stepped forward, hand extended. "I came as soon as I heard about last night's incident. I want to assure you that we take this matter with the utmost—" "Sit down, David." Alyssa's voice was flat, brooking no discussion. "This meeting isn't about assurances. It's about accountability." Brennan's hand dropped. He sat. Alyssa moved to the head of the table, connecting her laptop to the presentation system. The large screen flickered to life, displaying the hotel's logo. She remained standing, her presence commanding the room without effort. "Last night," she began, her voice carrying clearly despite its quietness, "I was humiliated, accused of fraud, and had my property destroyed in front of dozens of witnesses and thousands of online viewers. This morning, I've reviewed 3 years of employee records, guest complaints, and incident reports. What I discovered is that last night wasn't an aberration. It was standard operating procedure." Marcus flinched. Sarah's eyes were red-rimmed, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Jenkins stared at the table, his jaw clenched. Alyssa clicked to the next slide. It showed a graph, guest complaints coded by category. The red line representing discrimination-related incidents climbed steeply over the past 36 months. 42% increase in complaints regarding discriminatory service during Mr. Chen's tenure as night manager. These complaints come from guests of color, guests in modest clothing, guests with accents, guests who didn't fit someone's visual profile of what belongs in a luxury hotel. Another click. Screenshots of complaint letters appeared, names redacted but details preserved. "The night manager accused me of stealing my own watch because he didn't believe someone like me could afford it." That's from a guest who's a federal judge. "Security followed me through the lobby for 10 minutes because the desk clerk didn't think I looked like I belonged." That's from a guest who's a best-selling author. "I was asked to prepay for my room in cash because my credit card seemed suspicious." That's from a guest who's a neurosurgeon. Each quote landed like a physical blow. Brennan's face had gone ashen. Robert, the HR director, looked like he might be sick. But Marcus simply stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Chen," Alyssa's voice cut through the silence. "Do you remember any of these incidents?" He swallowed hard. "Some of them, but I was protecting the hotel. We have to be vigilant about fraud and—" "Vigilant." She repeated the word clinically. "Let's examine your vigilance." Another click. Video footage appeared, surveillance camera perspectives from various incidents over the past 3 years. The first showed Marcus questioning a young black man in business casual about whether he was sure he had a reservation. The man, it turned out, was the son of a Fortune 500 CEO. The second showed Marcus making a South Asian family wait 40 minutes at check-in while he verified their information that was completely legitimate. The third showed him instructing security to keep an eye on a Hispanic woman in jeans and a t-shirt who turned out to be a journalist writing a feature on luxury hotels. Each clip was time-stamped. Each clip was damning. And they kept playing one after another, building a narrative that couldn't be denied or explained away. "Your vigilance," Alyssa said, "appears to be selectively applied based on appearance, accent, and perceived economic status. Can you show me even one instance where you subjected a well-dressed white guest to this level of scrutiny?" Marcus's mouth opened, closed, opened again. I I treat everyone according to hotel standards. I don't discriminate. I've never... You destroyed my credit card last night because you decided within seconds that I couldn't afford to be here. Her voice remained level, but the words carried weight that made everyone in the room shift uncomfortably. You called me a fraud. You threatened me with police. You performed that humiliation for an audience. And the only thing that stopped you was discovering I owned the building. Without that revelation, what would have happened to me? The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. Sarah spoke suddenly, her voice cracking. He would have had you arrested. He's done it before. 2 years ago, there was a woman, black woman, wearing workout clothes, who insisted she had a reservation. Marcus called the police. She spent 4 hours in custody before her husband, who's a city councilman, got her released. The reservation existed. It was in the system. Marcus just didn't look. Sarah! Marcus's voice was sharp with panic. You don't know what you're... I know exactly what I'm talking about. Sarah's tears were flowing now, but her voice was steady. I've watched you do this for 3 years. I've watched you make people feel small because you could. I've watched you teach other staff members that this is acceptable. And I stayed quiet because I needed this job, because speaking up meant becoming your next target, because no one ever stopped you before. Jenkins cleared his throat, his deep voice rumbling. She's right. I've been in security for 8 years. I've seen good managers and bad managers. Mr. Chen isn't the worst I've encountered, but he's the most consistent. He has a type, people he decides don't belong, and once he's decided, nothing changes his mind. Not evidence, not policy, nothing. I've been ordered to follow guests, to intimidate them, to make them uncomfortable enough that they leave voluntarily. Every time I questioned it, I was told I was being insubordinate. So I stopped questioning. Marcus looked between them, betrayed and desperate. You're both lying. You're trying to save yourselves by blaming me. This is what happens, Alyssa interrupted, her voice cutting through his panic like a blade. When culture rots from the middle out, when one person's prejudices become department policy, when good people stay silent because speaking up costs too much, when institutions prioritize image over integrity. She clicked to another slide. This one showed internal memos, chat logs, break room conversations transcribed from employee interviews her team had been conducting since 5 a.m. Staff members describing Marcus's behavior, his training methods, his explicit instructions about which guests deserved scrutiny and which deserved deference. It was comprehensive. It was devastating. And it was undeniable. Brennan finally spoke, his voice hollow. I didn't know. I swear, Ms. Grant, if I'd known the extent, you had the complaint data. You signed off on the HR reports. You approved his performance reviews, which praised his vigilance and high standards. You knew. You just didn't look closely enough to see what was actually happening. That's not fair. I manage 4 properties. I can't personally investigate every complaint. No, but you can recognize patterns. You can ask why one manager generates 10 times the discrimination complaints of others. You can create systems that escalate problems instead of burying them. You can prioritize culture over convenience. She paused, letting the weight settle. You didn't. And that's why we're here. The room fell silent except for Sarah's quiet crying and the hum of the presentation equipment. Outside the conference room windows, the Chicago morning blazed bright and indifferent, the city moving forward while lives derailed in this climate-controlled space. Alyssa clicked to a new slide. It showed a simple question. What happens now? Mr. Chen, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. You're terminated effective immediately. You'll receive 2 weeks severance, which is more than legally required, but less than you'd get if I were inclined toward generosity. Your access to hotel systems has already been revoked. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. You have 1 hour. Marcus's face drained of color. You can't... I have rights. I'll sue for wrongful termination. You'll do nothing, Alyssa said flatly, because I have 3 years of documented discrimination, witness statements, video evidence, and 8 million people who watched you destroy company property and attempt to have your employer forcibly removed. If you sue, I'll defend aggressively, and every piece of evidence I just showed will become public record. Every news outlet covering this story will have access to your complete employment history. Is that really the next chapter you want written? His mouth worked soundlessly, Then he stood abruptly, his chair scraping against polished wood. This is because of one mistake. One bad night. You're going to destroy my career over a pattern of behavior that you never corrected because no one with power ever made you. Alyssa's voice remained calm, clinical. I'm not destroying your career, Mr. Chen. I'm ending your employment at this property. What you do next, how you grow from this, whether you examine your assumptions and biases, that's entirely up to you, but you won't do it here. Jenkins stood as well, his security training making him move toward Marcus instinctively. But Alyssa raised a hand, stopping him. Mr. Jenkins, please remain seated. Your situation is different. Jenkins froze, confusion and fear warring on his face. Marcus seized the moment, his voice rising desperately. See? She's going to keep him. She's going to punish me, but protect everyone else. This is targeted. This is over. Alyssa's voice cracked like a whip. Security will escort you out. If you say another word, I'll reduce your severance to 0 and ensure every hotel in this city knows exactly why you were terminated. Your choice. Patricia had already radioed for backup security. 2 guards appeared within seconds. Different ones from last night, but they'd clearly been briefed. They flanked Marcus, their professionalism absolute. Marcus looked at his former colleagues, seeking support or sympathy, but found only averted eyes. Then he was gone, the conference room door clicking shut with finality. The remaining occupants sat in thick silence. Sarah was still crying, quieter now, but no less devastated. Jenkins looked like he was waiting for an execution. Brennan and Robert exchanged glances that communicated years of professional relationship and shared culpability. Alyssa returned her attention to the screen, pulling up a new set of documents. Mr. Jenkins, Ms. Reeves, Sarah, I'm not terminating either of you, but I'm also not pretending last night was acceptable. Sarah's head snapped up. I tried to stop him. I told him to check the system. I know. You demonstrated moral courage in a situation where speaking up could cost you. That matters. Alyssa's voice softened fractionally. But it also matters that you've been watching this pattern for 3 years without reporting it through proper channels. Fear is understandable. Silence is forgivable up to a point, but silence also enables. Sarah wiped her eyes, nodding slowly. You're right. I should have reported him months ago, years ago. I was afraid of retaliation, of losing my job, of being labeled a troublemaker. But people got hurt because I stayed quiet. I'll accept whatever consequences. Your consequence is responsibility. Alyssa clicked to another slide, showing a new organizational chart. I'm restructuring night shift management. You're being promoted to overnight supervisor, reporting directly to Patricia. You'll undergo training on anti-discrimination policy, conflict resolution, and ethical escalation. Your first assignment is to rebuild the culture Marcus destroyed. You'll conduct listening sessions with every night shift employee. You'll review every complaint from the past 3 years and personally contact affected guests with formal apologies. You'll be the face of our accountability. Sarah stared at the screen, shocked. You're promoting me after you showed, even late and even fearfully, that you understood what was right. I need people who understand the weight of silence and have learned when to break it. Can you do this? Yes. The word came out fierce and certain. Yes, ma'am. I won't let you down. Good. Alyssa turned to Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, your situation is more complicated. You followed orders you knew were wrong. That's not the same as giving those orders, but it's also not blameless. You participated in making guests feel unwelcome, unsafe, and targeted. That violates every principle of hospitality and human decency. Why should I keep you? Jenkins met her gaze directly, his voice steady. You shouldn't. Not based on my performance. I failed the people I was supposed to protect because following orders felt safer than questioning authority. I convinced myself I was just doing my job. That responsibility stopped with whoever gave the commands. I was wrong. He paused, seeming to gather something. I'm a black man, Ms. Grant. I've been on the receiving end of exactly the kind of scrutiny I helped inflict on others. I know what it feels like to be followed through stores, questioned about whether I belong, treated as suspicious by default. And I still participated in doing it to others because I was afraid of losing my paycheck. That's unforgivable. But if you're willing to give me a chance, I'll spend however long I work here making sure no one else has to experience what I've experienced. The honesty was stark and uncomfortable. Alyssa studied him for a long moment, weighing risk against potential, punishment against rehabilitation. "You're being reassigned," she said finally. "No longer night shift security. You'll join our diversity and inclusion task force. Yes, we're creating one as of this morning. And you'll be responsible for training security staff across all our properties on bias recognition and ethical intervention. You'll teach people when to question orders, when to protect guests from staff, not just staff from guests. You'll use your failures as lessons, and if you ever follow an order you know is discriminatory again, you're terminated immediately. Clear?" "Crystal clear, ma'am." "Thank you. I won't waste this chance." Alyssa nodded, then turned to Brennan and Robert. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Mr. Brennan? Mr. Halstead, you're both wondering if you still have jobs." Brennan straightened, trying to project authority he'd lost hours ago. "Ms. Grant, I understand you're upset about last night, but terminating senior management over one employee's actions seems over institutional failure to address patterns you were responsible for monitoring." She cut him off without raising her voice. "You're not being terminated, Mr. Brennan, yet. But you're on notice. This hotel's culture didn't emerge from nowhere. It emerged from leadership that prioritized metrics over humanity, efficiency over dignity, image over substance. You created an environment where Marcus's behavior was tolerated, rewarded even, because it aligned with unspoken priorities. That ends now. We'll implement whatever changes. You'll implement nothing, because you're not making the decisions anymore." She clicked to another slide, showing a restructuring plan. "Effective immediately, all hotels in this portfolio report to a new oversight board I'm establishing. Every policy, every hiring decision, every complaint resolution will be reviewed for bias and effectiveness. You'll have quarterly audits conducted by external firms. Your compensation will be tied not just to revenue, but to employee satisfaction, guest inclusivity metrics, and cultural health indicators. You wanted to manage hotels, now you'll be managed in return." Brennan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Understood." "Mr. Halstead." Alyssa's attention shifted to the HR director, who'd been increasingly pale throughout the meeting. "You're in the most precarious position. You reviewed the complaint data. You conducted investigations that somehow always concluded incidents were misunderstandings rather than discrimination. You approved performance reviews that praised behavior that should have triggered immediate disciplinary action. Explain that." Robert cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly. I followed protocol. Every complaint was investigated according to a protocol designed to protect the company from liability, not to protect employees or guests from harm." Alyssa's voice was sharp now, cutting through his defensive posturing. "You treated discrimination complaints as PR problems to be managed rather than cultural failures to be corrected. You prioritized Marcus's tenure and position over vulnerable workers who came to you for help. That's not human resources. That's risk management disguised as human resources. I was trying to balance. You weren't balancing anything. You were choosing. And you consistently chose institutional protection over individual dignity." She paused, letting the accusation settle. "You're being transferred, not terminated, because, unlike Marcus, you operated within a broken system rather than breaking it yourself. But you're no longer overseeing HR for any property where guest interaction occurs. You'll be reassigned to policy development at corporate, where you'll help create the oversight systems that should have caught this years ago. Consider it penance with a purpose." Robert sagged slightly, relief and shame warring across his features. "Thank you, Ms. Grant. I'll do better. I promise." "Don't promise. Perform." She closed her laptop, the screen behind her fading to black. "All of you are being watched now, not just by me, but by 8 million people who watched last night's incident and are waiting to see if anything actually changes. Some of them are rooting for transformation. Others are waiting for this to be forgotten, for business as usual to resume, for the story to fade into internet history alongside 1,000 other viral moments of injustice. Which outcome we achieve depends entirely on what happens next." She stood, gathering her materials with deliberate precision. "Sarah, I want your first listening session report by end of week. Jenkins, training curriculum outline by Monday. Patricia, full night shift review by Wednesday. Brennan, you'll coordinate with the new oversight board. They'll contact you this afternoon. Robert, HR policy audit starts immediately. You'll work with external consultants who will arrive tomorrow. Everyone nodded, scrambling to take notes, the reality of immediate action replacing the abstraction of accountability discussions. Alyssa moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. One more thing. The footage from last night, the unedited versions showing the full context, will be released to media outlets this afternoon along with a statement. This story will continue. Reporters will contact you. Some of you will be interviewed. Remember that everything you say reflects not just on you personally, but on everyone who works here, everyone who stays here, everyone who trusted this institution to treat them with basic human dignity and had that trust violated. Sarah spoke up, her voice still shaky but determined. What should we say? The truth. That we failed. That we're changing. The transformation is uncomfortable but necessary. That we're not asking people to forget what happened, we're asking them to watch what we do next. Alyssa opened the door, bright lobby lights spilling into the conference room's controlled dimness. Don't make promises you can't keep. Don't minimize what happened. Don't blame individuals for systemic failures. And don't expect forgiveness just because you're trying. Change because it's right, not because it's expedient. She walked out, leaving the door open behind her. A deliberate choice. No more closed-door decisions. No more problems swept away where no one could see. Everything visible now. Everything accountable. The lobby buzzed with activity, but staff members still tracked her movement with anxious eyes. Alyssa approached the front desk where Patricia was coordinating the morning's operations with controlled urgency. Patricia, a word. They moved to a quiet corner near the concierge station. Patricia's professionalism was admirable, but stress showed in the tight set of her shoulders. You've been here 12 years, Alyssa said. You've worked every shift. You know this building better than anyone. Tell me honestly, did you know about Marcus? Patricia's jaw tightened. I suspected. I'd hear things, guest comments, staff complaints that never seemed to go anywhere. But night shift and day shift operate almost independently. I didn't have direct evidence, and when I raised concerns with management, I was told Marcus was handling his department appropriately. She met Alyssa's gaze. I should have pushed harder. I should have documented what I heard and taken it to corporate myself. I didn't. That's on me. What stopped you? Fear. Politics, the same things that stop everyone. Patricia's voice was bitter with self-recrimination. I told myself I didn't have proof, that it wasn't my responsibility, that making waves would jeopardize my own position. Classic bystander rationalization. I'm ashamed of it. Alyssa studied her for a moment. You're now interim general manager until I find Brennan's replacement. You'll have authority over all shifts, all departments, and direct access to me. Use it. When you see problems, escalate them. When you hear concerns, investigate them. When staff members come to you afraid to speak up elsewhere, protect them. Can you do that? Patricia straightened, something fierce igniting in her expression. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Good. Because this building is going to transform, and you're going to lead that transformation. I can provide resources, oversight, and support, but culture changes from the ground up. It needs someone who understands what we're trying to fix and has the courage to break what doesn't work. You'll have it, I promise. Alyssa nodded, then gestured to the lobby. One more thing. I want a memorial. A memorial? Here. Alyssa pointed to the spot where Marcus had destroyed her credit card. A plaque, something permanent. It should say, she paused, considering. Dignity is not optional. Everyone who enters here deserves respect regardless of appearance, accent, or assumption. We failed that principle. We're committed to never failing it again. Can you arrange that? Patricia's eyes widened. You want to memorialize last night, publicly? I want to ensure we never forget, that guests see we've acknowledged our failures, that staff remember what happens when prejudice disguises itself as policy, that everyone who walks through these doors understands we're serious about change. Alyssa's voice was steady, certain. This isn't about shame. It's about commitment, about making accountability visible and permanent. I'll have it designed today, installed by week's end. Thank you. Alyssa glanced at her watch. 10:47 a.m. Almost 12 hours since she'd first walked into this lobby. A different lifetime. I'm going back to the penthouse. I have calls with corporate counsel, PR teams, and our board of directors. Then I'm sleeping for approximately 4 hours before the evening news cycle hits. If anything urgent comes up, I'll handle it. That's what you're paying me for now. Patricia managed a small smile, the first genuine expression Alyssa had seen from her. Thank you, Ms. Grant, for not walking away, for caring enough to fix this. Thank you for being willing to help fix it. Alyssa turned toward the elevators, exhaustion finally catching up with adrenaline, the past 12 hours compressing into a wait that made each step deliberate. As she waited for the elevator, she noticed a young woman, college age, wearing jeans and a university sweatshirt, approaching the front desk with visible nervousness. The desk clerk greeted her warmly, checked her in without incident, and welcomed her to the hotel with genuine friendliness. The young woman's relief was palpable, her shoulders relaxing as she realized she wouldn't be questioned or scrutinized or made to feel less than. It was one interaction, one positive experience where yesterday there might have been suspicion. It wasn't transformation, but it was a start. And sometimes that's all you get, the fragile beginning of something better, built on the wreckage of something that should have been better all along. The elevator arrived. Alyssa stepped inside, letting the doors close on a lobby that was already changing, already becoming something different than it had been 13 hours ago. Whether that change lasted, whether it spread beyond this building to others in her portfolio, whether one viral moment could catalyze genuine institutional transformation, those were questions without answers yet. But as she ascended to the penthouse, Alyssa Grant felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope tempered by determination, optimism grounded in action, the particular satisfaction of using power not to crush but to correct, not to punish, but to transform systems that had failed too many people for far too long. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Media scrutiny, legal complications, the hard work of proving that promises made in crisis could be kept in calm. But tonight she would sleep in a penthouse she owned, in a building she was reshaping, knowing that one woman in worn sneakers had walked into a lobby designed to exclude her and walked out having changed everything. The promised 4 hours of sleep became 90 minutes of restless half-consciousness punctuated by phone notifications she'd forgotten to silence. Each buzz pulled Alyssa closer to wakefulness until she finally surrendered at 3:14 p.m., her body protesting but her mind already cataloging the fires that needed attention. The afternoon sun slanted through penthouse windows, painting geometric patterns across furniture she hadn't bothered to examine during last night's crisis. Now, in daylight, the space felt sterile despite its luxury, a stage set rather than a room, designed for projection rather than comfort. She reached for her phone, scrolling through the accumulated chaos. 147 emails, 32 missed calls, text messages from colleagues, journalists, lawyers, and people she hadn't spoken to in years suddenly eager to reconnect now that she was headline news. The story had metastasized beyond her control, spawning think pieces and hot takes, political commentary, and corporate analysis. Everyone had an opinion about what last night meant, what should happen next, whether her response was too harsh or not harsh enough. But buried among the noise was a message from Patricia, time-stamped 20 minutes ago. Media in lobby, refusing to leave without statement, police standing by but haven't intervened yet. Advise? Alyssa closed her eyes, letting frustration wash through her before forcing it aside. She'd known this was coming. Viral moments created feeding frenzies, and journalists smelled blood in the water. The question wasn't whether to engage, but how, what to say, what to withhold, how to control a narrative that had already escaped into the wild. She typed back, "Conference room in 30 minutes, credentialed press only. 5-minute statement, no questions. Have security remove anyone who disrupts." Then she stood, ignoring her body's complaints, and prepared to face cameras that would broadcast her words to the same millions who'd watched her humiliation. The irony wasn't lost on her. Transformed overnight from victim to authority figure, her credibility purchased with public degradation. But credibility was currency now, and she intended to spend it carefully. 28 minutes later, Alyssa descended to the lobby in a charcoal suit that photographed well under harsh lighting. Her hair was pulled back severely, her makeup minimal, her jewelry absent except for a watch that had belonged to her grandmother, the woman who'd cleaned hotel rooms for 40 years and never once been treated with the dignity she deserved. If cameras were going to capture her, they'd capture someone who remembered where she came from and why this mattered. The lobby had transformed into a circus. News vans lined the street outside, satellite dishes raised like metallic flowers seeking sun. Camera crews jockeyed for position while reporters rehearsed their intros, testing sound levels and adjusting lights. Hotel guests clustered in corners, phones out, documenting the documentation. Staff members tried to maintain normalcy, but their movements were stiff with awareness that everything they did was being recorded, analyzed, weaponized, or celebrated depending on perspective. Patricia intercepted Alyssa near the elevators, her professionalism admirable under pressure, but stress evident in the fine lines around her eyes. 17 media outlets, 3 canceled after we enforced the credentials requirement. The rest are set up in conference room 2. It's larger. Building security is monitoring, and I've briefed staff on emergency protocols if things escalate. Good work. Who's the most aggressive? Channel 7's reporter, Amanda Chen, no relation to Marcus despite what Twitter is claiming. She's been pushing staff for off-record comments. 2 producers tried to access security footage. And there's a freelance journalist who apparently flew in from New York specifically for this, though I can't figure out who's funding his coverage. Alyssa filed that detail away. Interesting that someone considered this story worth significant travel investment. Keep eyes on the freelancer. I want to know who he talks to and what he's digging for. Ready? Patricia nodded, though her hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her tablet. Together they walked toward conference room 2, staff members parting to create a path that felt simultaneously respectful and fearful. The conference room doors stood open, light and noise spilling into the hallway. Inside, cameras formed a semicircle facing a podium Patricia's team had assembled. Microphones clustered like metal bouquets. Reporters stood in hierarchical arrangement, network anchors front and center, local stations flanking, print journalists and bloggers relegated to the sides. All conversation ceased when Alyssa entered. She moved to the podium with measured steps, her expression neutral and controlled. No smile. That would seem performative. No scowl. That would seem defensive. Just professional competence, the face of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations and unimpressed by theatrical pressure. Thank you for coming. Her voice carried clearly without needing amplification. Years of boardroom experience teaching her how to command attention through tone rather than volume. I'm going to make a brief statement about last night's incident. I won't be taking questions afterward, but a written statement with additional details will be distributed to credentialed press within the hour. Phones and cameras lifted in unison, red recording lights blooming like eyes opening. Alyssa gripped the podium edges, anchoring herself. Last night, I was denied service, publicly humiliated, and had my property destroyed at a hotel I own because an employee made assumptions about my worth based on my appearance. This incident was captured on video and has been viewed millions of times. Many people have asked what I intend to do about this situation. Here's my answer. I intend to fix the system that created it. She paused, letting the words settle, watching reporters scribble notes and producers signal to camera operators for tighter shots. This wasn't one bad employee having one bad night. This was the visible manifestation of institutional culture that prioritized certain guests over others, that treated hospitality as something conditional rather than universal, that allowed discrimination to flourish because addressing it was inconvenient. I take responsibility for that failure. As majority shareholder, I should have been more vigilant. I should have dug deeper into complaint patterns. I should have demanded better from management. I didn't. That ends now. Amanda Chen's hand shot up despite the no questions rule, but Alyssa continued without acknowledging her. Effective immediately, all properties in this portfolio will undergo comprehensive cultural audits conducted by independent firms. We're establishing an oversight board with authority to investigate complaints and enforce accountability. We're implementing mandatory bias training for all staff, transparent reporting systems for guests who experience discrimination, and compensation structures that reward inclusive service rather than just revenue metrics. These aren't aspirational goals. These are binding policies with measurable outcomes and consequences for failure. The reporters were leaning forward now, hungry for specifics that would feed tomorrow's headlines. Alyssa gave them what they needed, concrete details that proved seriousness, while avoiding anything that could become legal liability. The employee directly responsible for last night's incident has been terminated. Other employees involved are being reassigned, retrained, or placed on performance improvement plans, depending on their level of culpability and willingness to change. Senior management is being restructured to ensure oversight that actually oversees rather than just documenting problems without solving them. These decisions were made after careful review of employment records, witness statements, and 3 years of data showing patterns that should have triggered intervention long ago. She could see the calculation happening behind reporter eyes, weighing her words against their preferred narratives, deciding which angles would generate the most engagement. Some wanted a revenge story, a powerful woman destroying careers. Others wanted a redemption arc, transforming pain into purpose. A few seemed genuinely interested in whether institutional change was possible or just performance. Alyssa couldn't control their framing, but she could give them enough substance that lazy narratives would seem inadequate. I want to address something I've seen in coverage and social media commentary. Some people have suggested this response is too harsh, that one incident doesn't warrant this level of disruption. To those people, I'd say, talk to the housekeepers who've been called thieves without evidence. Talk to the guests of color who've been followed through lobbies by security. Talk to the employees who reported problems and were told they were being too sensitive. Talk to anyone who's ever been made to feel that their dignity was negotiable based on someone else's prejudices. Then tell me this response is too harsh. The room had gone absolutely silent, except for the mechanical sounds of cameras adjusting focus. Even the most cynical reporters seemed caught by the raw sincerity in her voice, the way trauma and determination alchemized into something that transcended corporate PR. Last night was humiliating. It was painful. But it was also clarifying. I now understand what countless other people have experienced without having the power to demand accountability. I intend to use that power not for revenge, but for reform. Not to punish individuals, but to transform systems. Not to make myself feel better, but to ensure this never happens to anyone else in any property I control. She released the podium, stepping back slightly to signal conclusion. That's all I have to say publicly right now. Written statements with policy details will be distributed shortly. I ask that you respect our staff's need to focus on serving guests rather than fielding media inquiries. Thank you. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds before erupting into shouted questions. Amanda Chen's voice cut through the cacophony. Ms. Grant, are you concerned about lawsuits from terminated employees? A man near the back yelled, "How much is this going to cost shareholders?" Someone else demanded, "Do you think this incident reflects broader problems in the hospitality industry?" Alyssa walked toward the exit without responding, Patricia running interference while security ensured the crowd didn't surge forward. But as she reached the doorway, she heard a question that made her pause despite her intention to ignore everything. Ms. Grant, there are allegations that Marcus Chen filed complaints about you years ago when you first acquired this property. Did last night have anything to do with those complaints? Was this personal? She turned slowly, scanning the crowd for the source. The freelance journalist from New York, his expression eager and predatory. Someone had fed him information, detailed information that wasn't in any public filing. Someone was trying to reframe this as a vendetta rather than accountability. I'm not aware of any such complaints, she said carefully, her voice cold. But if they exist, they'll be reviewed as part of our comprehensive audit. If you have documentation of these allegations, I encourage you to submit them through proper channels rather than ambushing people in press conferences. So you're not denying that this could be revenge for... I'm denying your premise that holding people accountable for discrimination is revenge. Those are fundamentally different concepts, and conflating them serves no one except those who benefit from the status quo. She let the rebuke hang for a moment, watching him absorb the public correction. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a hotel to run. This time she didn't pause, pushing through the doors with Patricia close behind. The hallway offered brief respite, but both women knew the journalist's question would spawn new conspiracy theories, new angles designed to undermine her credibility by suggesting ulterior motives. It was predictable. and infuriating, and exactly what happened when you tried to change systems that people had invested in maintaining. That was brutal, Patricia said quietly once they were safely away from cameras. But effective. You gave them substance without giving them ammunition. Someone fed that journalist information from sealed personnel files. Someone inside this organization wants to protect Marcus, or undermine the reforms, or just create chaos. Alyssa's jaw was tight with controlled fury. I need to know who. Pull access logs for Marcus's HR records. See who's been viewing them in the past 48 hours. And I want background checks on anyone who's had contact with media, especially that New York freelancer. On it. Should I notify legal? Already done. They're preparing for the inevitable lawsuits, wrongful termination, defamation, whatever Marcus's lawyers can manufacture. We'll win because we have evidence, but it'll be expensive and distracting and exactly what someone's hoping for. They reached the elevator bank, but instead of ascending to the penthouse, Alyssa pressed the button for the basement level. Patricia looked confused but didn't question, following her into the elevator's fluorescent brightness. Where are we going? Staff break room. I want to talk to the people who actually keep this building running. The ones who clean rooms and carry luggage and deal with guests' worst behavior for wages that barely cover rent. They're the ones who see everything, who know which managers deserve respect and which inspire fear. If I'm going to fix this place, I need to understand what it looks like from the bottom. The basement was utilitarian in ways the lobby could never be. Concrete floors, exposed pipes, industrial lighting that turned everyone slightly gray. They navigated corridors marked with faded directional signs until reaching a door labeled Employee Lounge. Inside, a dozen people in housekeeping uniforms and maintenance coveralls sat at worn tables, their break interrupted by the sudden appearance of the owner they'd probably never expected to meet. Conversations died. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips. A young woman near the vending machine looked like she might bolt. Alyssa understood the fear. Ownership descending to the basement usually meant layoffs or policy changes that made already difficult jobs harder. She'd seen it at every property she'd acquired, the way power created automatic defensiveness in people who'd learned that management visits meant trouble. Please don't let me interrupt your break, she said, her voice gentler than it had been in the press conference. I'm Alyssa Grant. I own the building, but more importantly, I used to clean buildings. My grandmother cleaned hotel rooms for 40 years. She taught me that the people doing the hardest work usually get the least recognition. So I'm here to ask what you need, what you've seen, and what you think should change. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Eyes darted to Patricia, seeking permission or reassurance. Finally, an older woman with steel gray hair and hands weathered by decades of chemical cleaning agents spoke up, her accent marking her as first-generation immigrant. You really want to know? Or you just want to feel better about firing Marcus? The directness was startling and refreshing. Alyssa pulled out a chair and sat, deliberately positioning herself at eye level rather than standing over them. I really want to know, and I can't promise I'll like what you tell me, but I promise I'll listen and I'll act on what I hear. The older woman, her name tag read Irina, studied her for a long moment, then shrugged. Marcus was terrible. Everyone knows this, but he wasn't the only problem. Day shift manager, he ignores when guests are rude to us, when they call us names, when they complain about our accents. We report, nothing happens. So we stop reporting. What's the point? Others nodded, their silence breaking into murmured agreement. A younger man in maintenance coveralls added, I fixed a toilet on the 14th floor last week. Guest accused me of stealing cash from his dresser. No evidence, no investigation, just accusation. Security searched me right there in the hallway. Found nothing because I didn't take nothing. No apology. Just, you can go now. I reported sexual harassment from a guest, a housekeeper said quietly, her eyes fixed on the table. 3 times. Wrote it up properly. Gave room number. Described what he said and did. Supervisor told me to be professional and just avoid his room. Like I have a choice when it's on my assignment list. The stories came faster now, building on each other. A cascade of small degradations and systemic failures that individually seemed manageable but collectively painted a picture of institutional dysfunction. Guests who treated staff as invisible. Managers who prioritized guest satisfaction over employee dignity. HR representatives who processed complaints as bureaucratic obligations rather than calls for help, a culture that preached service excellence while tolerating casual cruelty toward those providing that service. Alyssa listened without interrupting, her anger growing colder and more focused with each account. This was what happened when leadership measured success in quarterly earnings rather than human cost. This was what happened when the people at the top never descended to the basement to hear what the people at the bottom experienced daily. When the stories finally subsided into exhausted silence, she spoke carefully, knowing words alone meant nothing but needing to start somewhere. Everything you've just told me is unacceptable. It's also, unfortunately, not surprising. I've seen similar patterns at other properties. The hospitality industry has a fundamental problem. It's built on the idea that guests deserve perfect service without acknowledging that service is provided by human beings who deserve dignity and protection. Nice words, Irina said bluntly. But words don't pay bills or stop guests from treating us like furniture. You're right, which is why I'm implementing changes that go beyond words. Starting next week, every property in this portfolio will have an employee advocate, someone whose only job is representing staff concerns directly to ownership, bypassing management entirely. You'll have their contact information and direct access. Reports will be investigated within 48 hours, and you'll receive updates on outcomes. Management performance reviews will include staff satisfaction scores weighted equally with guest satisfaction. The maintenance worker who'd been accused of theft leaned forward, skepticism evident. And when guests complain that we're being uppity for demanding respect, when they threaten bad reviews because we didn't tolerate harassment, what happens then? Then we explain to those guests that our staff's dignity is not negotiable and invite them to find accommodation elsewhere. Yes, that will cost us some business. Yes, that will impact short-term revenue. But I'd rather run a hotel that treats everyone, guests and employees, with respect than maximize profits while ignoring abuse. Your investors won't like that, someone muttered. My investors will learn to accept it, or they'll divest. I control enough shares that I can weather short-term pressure in service of long-term transformation. Alyssa met each person's eyes in turn, letting them see the determination behind her words. I'm not promising perfection. I'm not promising immediate change. Systems take time to rebuild, and culture shifts slowly, but I'm promising action, accountability, and resources. And I'm promising that when you report problems, someone will listen and respond. Irina was still skeptical, but less hostile now. Why should we believe you? You're rich. You own buildings. Why do you care what happens to housekeepers and maintenance workers? Alyssa could have deflected, could have given a polished answer about corporate values and brand reputation. Instead, she told the truth. Because 20 years ago, I was where you are, cleaning offices at night to pay for community college classes during the day, getting paid under minimum wage because my employer knew I couldn't complain without risking deportation consequences for family members. Being told I should be grateful for any job at all, that my expectations of fair treatment were unrealistic. I remember what it felt like to be invisible to people who would be nothing without my labor. And I promised myself that if I ever had power, I'd use it differently. The room had gone very quiet, the initial defensiveness replaced by cautious consideration. People who'd spent careers being dismissed could recognize sincerity when they heard it, or at least recognize when someone was making an effort to connect, rather than just performing empathy for credit. So what do you want from us? The housekeeper who'd reported harassment asked. Honesty, documentation, partnership. Alyssa pulled out her phone, opening a notes app. Tell me what policies need to change. Tell me which managers deserve promotion and which need removal. Tell me what would make your job safer, more sustainable, more dignified. I can't implement everything immediately, but I can prioritize based on what you say matters most. What followed was 90 minutes of brutally honest feedback, delivered by people who'd spent years watching problems be ignored. They talked about inadequate break rooms and insufficient staffing ratios, about guests who vandalized rooms and left housekeepers to clean biohazards without proper equipment, about managers who played favorites and created hostile competition among employees, about language barriers that isolated immigrant workers, about the exhaustion of maintaining luxury for people who would never acknowledge your humanity. Alyssa took notes on everything, asking clarifying questions and promising specific follow-up timelines. Patricia, standing near the door, looked increasingly shell-shocked as the extent of operational dysfunction became impossible to deny. But she also took notes, her earlier skepticism about transformation giving way to understanding of just how much needed to change. By the time people began glancing at watches and preparing to return to shifts, something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. Not trust exactly, that would take far longer to build, but possibility. The sense that maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be another empty gesture, another management initiative that faded as soon as media attention moved elsewhere. As Alyssa stood to leave, Irina approached, her weathered face serious. "You do what you say. We'll support you. You forget us once cameras leave, we'll make sure everyone knows. Clear?" "Crystal clear. And for what it's worth, I hope you hold me to that. Power needs accountability, and I'm trusting you to provide it." Irina's expression softened fractionally. "Your grandmother, she's still alive?" "No, she died 5 years ago. Worked until she was 73 because her pension wasn't enough to live on. She'd be proud of you today. Maybe not yesterday for letting things get this bad, but today." The older woman patted her arm, a gesture both maternal and appraising. "Don't waste this chance. People are watching." "I know. That's what makes it terrifying and necessary." Alyssa and Patricia left the break room, ascending back toward the lobby and the chaos that awaited there. But something had shifted in Alyssa's understanding of what transformation required. It wasn't just policy changes and oversight boards. It was relationship, connection between people who usually occupied completely separate worlds. It was listening to voices that had been speaking all along, just never to anyone who could do anything about what they said. The elevator rose through the building's levels, each floor representing a different economic reality. Basement, where workers gathered. Guest floors, where wealthy travelers slept. Executive suites, where decisions got made. Penthouse, where ownership lived in isolation. The architecture itself encoded hierarchy, separating people by function and status, making it easier to ignore how systems actually worked when you never had to see their full operation. "That was illuminating," Patricia said quietly as they approached the lobby level. "I thought I knew what was happening in this building. Turns out, I was blind to most of it." We all were. That's how institutional dysfunction persists, through layers of people who each see only their own piece and never connect them into the full picture. Alyssa checked her phone, finding messages from her legal team requesting urgent consultation. The hard part starts now, actually delivering on everything I just promised, making changes that will be expensive and unpopular with everyone who benefited from the old system. Are you ready for that fight? Alyssa thought about Irina's weathered hands, the maintenance worker's humiliation, the housekeeper's unanswered harassment reports. She thought about her grandmother, who'd died tired and broke despite a lifetime of honest work. She thought about her younger self, scrubbing toilets while business school classmates networked at cocktail parties she couldn't afford to attend. I don't have a choice. Readiness doesn't matter. Only action matters now. The elevator doors opened onto a lobby that was finally beginning to return to normal operations. Media vans departing to edit footage for evening broadcasts. But Alyssa knew normal was exactly what they couldn't return to. Normal was what had allowed Marcus to flourish. Normal was what had protected patterns of discrimination and harassment. Normal was the enemy of everything she'd promised in the past 16 hours. Transformation would be expensive, exhausting, and politically complicated. It would make enemies of people who preferred convenience over justice. It would generate headlines celebrating her today and criticizing her tomorrow when change proved messier than anyone anticipated. It would cost money and time and energy she'd rather spend on business growth. But it was also the only choice that let her look at herself in mirrors and recognize someone her grandmother would respect. So Alyssa squared her shoulders, took a breath that tasted like expensive lobby air and basement concrete, and prepared to dismantle everything that had been built on foundations of casual cruelty disguised as standards. The real work was just beginning, and this time everyone was watching. 3 weeks after the incident, Alyssa stood in a conference room on the hotel's 3rd floor, staring at a spreadsheet that represented both progress and resistance in equal measure. The numbers told a complicated story. Guest satisfaction scores had actually increased by 8%, but several major corporate accounts had quietly shifted their business to competitors. Revenue was down 11%, but employee retention had improved dramatically. The transformation she'd promised was happening, but it was costing more than her board of directors had anticipated, and more than some were willing to tolerate. Her phone buzzed with another message from Richard Westwood, the board's most vocal skeptic and a man who'd made his fortune through ruthless efficiency. Emergency board meeting. Tomorrow, 9 a.m., New York. Non-negotiable. The lack of explanation was deliberate, a power play designed to put her on defensive footing, to remind her that ownership didn't mean absolute authority when other people's money was involved. Patricia appeared in the doorway, her expression tight with concern. The auditors just finished their preliminary report on the other properties in the portfolio. You're going to want to see this before tomorrow's meeting. Alyssa accepted the tablet, scanning executive summaries that confirmed her worst suspicions. The Chicago incident hadn't been an anomaly. It was a pattern replicated across 7 hotels in 5 cities. Different managers, different circumstances, but the same underlying dysfunction. Discrimination complaints buried in bureaucratic processes. Staff turnover blamed on market conditions rather than toxic management. Guest feedback sanitized to protect brand reputation rather than address systemic problems. The entire portfolio was infected with the same disease, and cutting out the Chicago tumor had only exposed how deep the rot actually went. How bad is the financial impact if we implement reforms across all properties simultaneously? Alyssa asked, though she already knew the answer would be painful. Patricia pulled up a financial model, her fingers trembling slightly as she navigated screens. Conservatively, $40 million in the first year. New training programs, compensation adjustments, facility improvements, external auditing costs, and revenue loss from guests who prefer the old standards. That's assuming we don't face major lawsuits from terminated employees or discrimination claims from affected guests. And if we implement reforms gradually, property by property. Lower immediate costs, but higher risk of continued incidents generating negative publicity. Plus, it signals we're not serious about transformation, that we're managing optics rather than fixing culture. Alyssa set down the tablet, the weight of accumulated decisions pressing against her chest. This was the moment she'd been dreading since that night in the lobby, when idealism collided with economic reality, when doing the right thing required sacrifices that people who'd never been discriminated against would view as unnecessary extravagance. We implement simultaneously across all properties. I'll handle the board. Alyssa. Patricia rarely used her first name, the familiarity a marker of how serious she considered the situation. Richard Westwood controls 23% of voting shares through various entities. If he convinces 2 other board members to join him, they can force you out as CEO. They can't take your ownership stake, but they can strip your operational authority and install management that will undo everything we've started. Then I'll need to convince them that transformation is worth the cost. That's what tomorrow's meeting is really about, whether they trust my vision enough to accept short-term pain for long-term sustainability. Patricia looked like she wanted to argue but recognized the futility. Instead, she shifted to logistics. The memorial plaque is being installed this afternoon. Guest response has been overwhelmingly positive, but there's been backlash from a particular demographic. Online reviews complaining about virtue signaling and political correctness. Some threatening boycotts. How many? 47 negative reviews in the past week explicitly mentioning the plaque. But we've received over 300 positive reviews in the same period from guests who appreciate the accountability. The negative voices are just louder. Alyssa nodded, unsurprised. Every action toward justice generated proportional resistance from those invested in the status quo. The question was whether leadership had the courage to withstand that resistance long enough for new norms to become established. Keep monitoring, but don't respond directly. Let the reviews speak for themselves. People can read 47 complaints about accountability and 300 affirmations and draw their own conclusions about which guests we're trying to attract. She spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for tomorrow's confrontation, building a presentation that would need to satisfy both moral and economic arguments. She compiled data on long-term brand value, demographic shifts in luxury travel markets, legal liability reduction, employee productivity improvements, and competitive positioning. But underneath the spreadsheets and projections was a simpler truth she'd have to articulate. Some things mattered more than quarterly earnings, and if the board couldn't accept that, she'd find board members who could. That evening, as she packed for the early morning flight to New York, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. Years of business training had taught her to be cautious about unknown calls, but curiosity won. "Ms. Grant? This is Evelyn Torres. You don't know me, but I was at your hotel 3 years ago. I'm the woman who was arrested because Marcus Chen didn't believe I had a reservation." Alyssa's hand tightened on the phone. "Ms. Torres, I'm so deeply sorry for what you experienced. I've been trying to locate guests who were affected by discriminatory practices to offer formal apologies and discuss remediation. I know, your team contacted me last week. I wasn't going to call back. I was going to let lawyers handle it, because that's what you do when you spend 4 hours in police custody for the crime of checking into a hotel while black. But then I watched what you've been doing since that night, and I needed to tell you something." Alyssa waited, bracing for anger that would be entirely justified. "What happened to you? It was terrible, but it was also visible, recorded, undeniable. When it happened to me, there were no cameras. My husband had to pull connections to even get me released, and the hotel acted like I was the problem for making a scene. They offered me a free night stay if I signed an NDA, like my dignity could be purchased for the cost of a room." The words landed like blows, each one a reminder of how systemic the failures had been. "Did you sign it?" "No, but I also didn't have the resources to fight properly. I filed a complaint with the city's Human Rights Commission. It went nowhere. I wrote reviews online, and they got buried under algorithmic suppression or drowned out by positive reviews from people who never experienced what I did. Eventually, I gave up because fighting was costing me more than the hotel ever would. That's how they win, by making justice too expensive for most people to pursue. That's going to change. I can't undo what happened to you, but I can ensure it never happens to anyone else." Evelyn's laugh was bitter and weary. "You can try, but your board is going to push back. Your investors are going to demand you prioritize profit over principle. And eventually, you'll face a choice between your values and your position. I'm calling to tell you that when you face that choice, because you will, remember that people like me are watching. People who've been humiliated and dismissed and told we're overreacting. We're watching to see if someone with power will actually use it differently. I won't forget. And if legal settlements are appropriate in your case, my team will work with you on fair compensation. I don't want your money, Ms. Grant. I want you to win. Not just the immediate fight, but the long war against systems that treat people like problems to be managed. So when your board tries to convince you that discrimination is just the cost of doing business, remember that cost falls on real people. People with names and families and dignity that shouldn't be negotiable." The call ended, leaving Alyssa staring at her phone in the suite's gathering darkness. Evelyn Torres had given her something more valuable than forgiveness. She'd given her clarity about what was actually at stake tomorrow. Not just policies and procedures, but whether institutions could change or whether they simply protected themselves until pressure subsided. The flight to New York departed at 6 a.m., giving Alyssa 3 hours of restless semi-consciousness while her mind rehearsed arguments and anticipated objections. She landed at LaGuardia into gray morning drizzle that matched her mood, the city's energy feeling more oppressive than energizing. A car service delivered her to the Midtown office building where Grant Capital Holdings maintained its board meeting facilities, glass and steel architecture designed to project invincible confidence. Richard Westwood was already there when she arrived, holding court with 2 other board members in the lobby's cafe. He was a man who cultivated intimidation through understated power, his suit bespoke but not flashy, his watch expensive but not ostentatious, his entire presentation calculated to communicate that he belonged in rooms where decisions got made. When he saw Alyssa, his smile was polite and predatory. "Alyssa, good of you to come on such short notice. I hope the flight wasn't too taxing." The false concern was deliberate provocation, suggesting she was fragile or unprepared. She refused the bait. "Richard, always a pleasure to gather the board for substantive discussion." They moved upstairs to a conference room that could have hosted treaty negotiations, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of Manhattan that cost more per square foot than most people earned annually. The remaining board members filtered in, 9 people whose collective net worth exceeded several billion dollars, and whose patience for idealism had been ground down by decades of prioritizing returns over everything else. Westwood called the meeting to order with perfunctory efficiency, dispensing with pleasantries to establish dominance. We're here because Ms. Grant has initiated significant policy changes across our hospitality portfolio without full board consultation. These changes are impacting revenue, generating negative press from certain demographics, and raising concerns about long-term strategic direction. Alyssa, would you like to explain your decision-making process? The framing was deliberately adversarial, positioning her as reckless rather than responsive. Alyssa stood, moving to the presentation screen with controlled confidence. 3 weeks ago, I experienced firsthand the discrimination that our guests and employees have been reporting for years. The incident was public, viral, and undeniable. It exposed institutional failures that required immediate action. That action is now underway across all properties, and yes, it's expensive. It's also necessary, legally prudent, and ultimately profitable if we're thinking beyond quarterly returns. She clicked to her first slide, showing the comparison between immediate costs and projected long-term value. $40 million first-year investment against reduced legal liability, improved employee retention, expanded market positioning, and brand differentiation in an increasingly competitive landscape. Our research shows that 62% of luxury travelers under 40 prioritize corporate values in accommodation choices. We're positioning to capture that demographic while competitors continue serving the shrinking market of people who equate discrimination with standards. Westwood leaned back, his expression skeptical. That's a very optimistic interpretation of consumer behavior. What about the 47 negative reviews explicitly criticizing your woke policies? What about the corporate accounts we've lost? What about shareholders who invested in hospitality returns, not social justice initiatives? Those 47 reviews are outnumbered 7-1 by positive reviews from guests who appreciate our accountability. The corporate accounts we lost were primarily from companies with their own discrimination scandals who didn't want association with businesses taking ethical stands. And shareholders who prioritize short-term extraction over sustainable business practices are welcome to divest. We'll find investors who understand that institutions built on exploitation eventually collapse. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Board members exchanged glances that communicated decades of unspoken understanding about how business actually worked. A woman named Catherine Mercer, who'd made her fortune in private equity, spoke up with deceptive gentleness. Alyssa, no one here opposes treating people well, but there's a difference between preventing discrimination and implementing expensive reforms that suggest our entire industry is fundamentally broken. You're creating a narrative that could damage not just our properties, but hospitality businesses generally. Have you considered the broader implications? I've considered that our industry has survived this long by externalizing costs onto vulnerable workers and discriminated guests. I've considered that sustainability requires actually sustaining human dignity, not just profit margins. And I've considered that I'd rather lead the transformation than be dragged into it by lawsuits, boycotts, and social movements that aren't going to accept, but it's always been this way, as justification for continued harm. Catherine's polite expression hardened slightly. That sounds like you're prioritizing your personal moral comfort over fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. I'm prioritizing long-term institutional viability over short-term extraction. If you think those are the same thing, I'd suggest your own priorities need examination. The confrontation was escalating faster than Alyssa had intended, but she'd learned long ago that showing weakness in rooms like this was fatal. These people respected strength, even when they disagreed with its direction. Westwood sensed the shift and moved to consolidate opposition. I'm calling for a vote of no confidence in Ms. Grant's operational authority. She's demonstrated that she's prioritizing personal agenda over shareholder returns. I propose we install interim management while conducting a thorough review of her decisions and their financial impact. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Alyssa had known this was coming, but hearing it stated so baldly still felt like a gut punch. She scanned the room, calculating alliances and identifying who might be persuadable. 4 board members looked uncomfortable with Westwood's aggression. 3 looked sympathetic to his argument. 2 were impossible to read. Before you vote, Alyssa said, her voice cutting through the tension. "I want you to watch something." She pulled up video footage on the main screen, not the viral clip from that night, but something else. Security camera footage from 7 different properties over the past 3 years, edited into a devastating compilation. Guests being followed by security. Employees being berated by management. Complaints being dismissed by HR representatives who treated discrimination as inconvenience. The footage played without narration, each clip time-stamped and labeled with the property name. The board watched in growing discomfort as their portfolio's dysfunction unfolded in grainy surveillance detail. When the compilation ended, Alyssa let the silence stretch before speaking. "This is what you're asking me to protect. This is what returning to normal operations means. Every person in that footage has legal standing to sue. Every incident represents potential liability that your risk management ignored because addressing it was expensive and complicated. I'm not imposing my personal morality. I'm preventing catastrophic institutional failure that you were all too comfortable ignoring." Westwood's jaw tightened. "You're using sensationalism to manipulate emotional response instead of addressing the economic reality. The economic reality is that we're facing at least 17 potential discrimination lawsuits that I know about, and probably dozens more that victims haven't filed yet because they lack resources or gave up on justice. The economic reality is that one more viral incident could destroy our brand entirely. The economic reality is that transformation is cheaper than collapse, and collapse is where we were headed before I intervened." Catherine Mercer was studying the darkened screen with an expression that suggested she was recalculating her position. How many of these incidents could have been prevented with proper oversight? All of them. That's the point. We had systems that looked impressive on paper but functioned primarily to protect the company from accountability rather than prevent harm. I'm replacing those systems with ones that actually work. And yes, it's expensive because doing things correctly costs more than doing things conveniently. A board member named James Park, who'd been silent until now, leaned forward, his voice thoughtful. "I've reviewed your implementation plan. It's aggressive, but it's also comprehensive. And the preliminary data from the Chicago property shows guest satisfaction increasing even as we've lost some accounts. Could you walk us through why that's happening?" Alyssa seized the opening, pivoting to data that told a story of transformation actually working. She showed survey results from guests who specifically chose the hotel because of its public commitment to accountability. She showed employee retention metrics that translated directly to service quality improvements. She showed social media sentiment analysis demonstrating that their brand was being discussed in aspirational terms by demographics that competitors couldn't reach. "We're not just preventing bad behavior," she explained, her confidence building as the presentation progressed. "We're actively creating culture that attracts people who value dignity alongside luxury. That's a market segment that's growing while traditional luxury travelers age out. We're positioning for the next 20 years, not just the next quarter." Westwood tried to interrupt several times, but other board members were asking questions now, engaging with the substance rather than just resisting change. The momentum had shifted, and even Catherine Mercer looked less certain about opposing reforms. "I still have concerns about the cost," Catherine said carefully, "but I'm willing to give this approach 6 months before making judgments about operational authority. Richard, perhaps instead of a vote of no confidence, we could establish enhanced reporting requirements and regular reviews." It was a compromise that let everyone save face while giving Alyssa the runway she needed. Westwood recognized the loss of support and accepted with barely concealed frustration. "Fine, enhanced oversight. But if revenue continues declining or if we face major lawsuits, we revisit operational structure immediately." "Agreed," Alyssa said, relief flooding through her despite her controlled exterior. "I'll provide monthly detailed reports and make myself available for consultations as needed." The meeting continued for another 90 minutes, working through implementation details and establishing oversight mechanisms. By the time they adjourned, Alyssa was exhausted but victorious. She'd maintained her authority while accepting accountability structures that were actually reasonable. Westwood left without speaking to her, his anger evident in the precise way he closed his briefcase and exited. But James Park approached as others filtered out, his expression cautiously optimistic. "That was impressive. Most people would have buckled under Richard's pressure. You didn't just defend your decisions, You made us complicit in them by showing us what we'd been ignoring. That's leadership. Thank you. Though I'm not sure everyone shares your assessment. Richard's not wrong that this is expensive and risky, but he's wrong that it's just your personal crusade. What you're doing, it matters. My daughter was discriminated against at a hotel last year because the staff made assumptions about young Asian women traveling alone. She didn't report it because she didn't think anyone would care. When I told her about your reforms, she actually cried, said maybe things were finally changing. The anecdote hit harder than any financial argument could have. This was why transformation mattered, not because spreadsheets justified it, but because human beings deserved institutions that protected their dignity. Tell your daughter I'm sorry she experienced that, and tell her we're trying to make sure it doesn't happen to others. I will. And Alyssa, don't let Richard grind you down. He's a brilliant investor, but a terrible human being. You're both. That's rare. Alyssa flew back to Chicago that evening, processing the day's emotional violence while watching clouds turn gold beneath a setting sun. She'd won the battle, but the war was far from over. 6 months to prove transformation could be profitable, sustainable, scalable. 6 months during which any major incident could vindicate Westwood's skepticism and cost her operational authority. But when she landed and checked her messages, there was one from Patricia that made the entire exhausting ordeal feel worthwhile. Memorial plaque installed. Guest response overwhelmingly positive. One guest, elderly black woman who's been coming here for 30 years, stood in front of it and cried. Said she never thought she'd see the day a hotel acknowledged what she'd experienced. Thought you should know. Alyssa read the message 3 times, letting it anchor her against the doubt that always crept in during quiet moments. This was why she'd risked everything. Not for board approval or media praise, but for the elderly woman who'd endured 3 decades of discrimination and finally saw it acknowledged. For Evelyn Torres, who spent 4 hours in custody for the crime of existing. For her grandmother, who cleaned rooms until her body gave out and never received the dignity she deserved. The transformation was messy, expensive, and incomplete. But it was happening. And sometimes that was enough. Not the destination, but the genuine movement toward something better, built on the wreckage of everything that had been accepted for too long. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Media scrutiny would continue, board pressure would intensify, staff implementation would reveal complications no policy manual could anticipate. But tonight, in the quiet of a plane descending toward a city where one hotel had begun the difficult work of becoming something other than what it had always been, Alyssa Grant allowed herself to feel something dangerous and necessary. Hope tempered by determination, optimism grounded in action, the particular satisfaction of knowing that power, when wielded with purpose, could actually change the systems everyone else accepted as unchangeable. The plane touched down. The city lights spread below like promises and challenges intermingled. And somewhere in a lobby she'd once been thrown out of, a plaque reminded everyone who entered that dignity was not optional, that accountability was not performance, that transformation was possible when someone with power finally decided convenience mattered less than justice. 6 months later, Alyssa stood in the same lobby where everything had changed, but the space itself had been subtly transformed in ways both visible and invisible. The memorial plaque gleamed under chandelier light, its bronze surface polished by maintenance staff who'd taken unexpected pride in caring for it. Fresh flowers appeared beside it each morning, placed there by employees without being asked, a small ritual that had emerged organically from people who finally felt their dignity mattered to the institution they served. The board meeting scheduled for this afternoon would determine whether her reforms survived or whether Richard Westwood's faction finally gained enough support to strip her operational authority. 6 months of data, 6 months of incidents and responses, 6 months of transformation that had cost exactly what she'd projected and generated results that were more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Revenue was still down 7% across the portfolio, but employee turnover had dropped 43%. Guest satisfaction scores had increased 12% overall, though satisfaction among certain demographics, older, wealthier, whiter, had decreased measurably. The transformation was working, but it was redistributing comfort in ways that made some people deeply uncomfortable. Patricia approached with a tablet, her expression combining anxiety and determination in equal measure. The auditors just submitted their final 6-month review. Overall assessment is that reforms have been implemented effectively across all properties with measurable cultural improvements. But they've also documented resistance from middle management, ongoing complaints from guests who preferred the old standards, and concerns about long-term financial sustainability if revenue trends continue. So they're giving Westwood ammunition while acknowledging we've done what we said we'd do. Essentially, the board call starts in 2 hours. Richard has been lobbying members all week. Catherine Mercer is still undecided, and James Park is supportive but worried about fiduciary liability if other investors start pushing back. Alyssa nodded, having anticipated this exact scenario. The question had never been whether transformation would be easy or immediately profitable. It was whether the board had enough vision to accept short-term costs for long-term positioning. Is everything ready for the presentation? Yes, though I still think leading with the financial data is risky. It's not going to look good compared to industry averages. It's not supposed to look good. It's supposed to look honest. We're not going to win by pretending reform is painless. We're going to win by proving it's necessary and sustainable. Before Patricia could respond, Sarah approached from the front desk, her transformation over the past 6 months visible in everything from her posture to her confidence. As overnight supervisor, she'd become the face of cultural change, conducting listening sessions and implementing feedback with a dedication that had surprised everyone, including herself. Ms. Grant, there's a guest who's been waiting to speak with you. She says it's important but won't explain to anyone else. Should I? I'll speak with her. Where is she? Sarah gestured toward the lobby seating area where an elderly woman sat with the careful stillness of someone conserving limited energy. She was black, probably in her 70s, dressed in clothes that suggested middle-class comfort without ostentation. As Alyssa approached, the woman stood with visible effort, her eyes assessing with an intensity that suggested she saw more than most people revealed. Ms. Grant? I'm Lorraine Mitchell. I don't have an appointment, but I needed to speak with you before you meet with your board today. Alyssa's surprise must have shown because Lorraine smiled slightly. I'm a retired corporate attorney. I still have connections who keep me informed about things that matter, and this matters. May we sit? They settled into adjacent chairs, the lobby's elegant bustle continuing around them. Lorraine took a moment to gather her thoughts, her hands folded in her lap with the precision of someone who'd spent decades projecting authority in rooms that didn't want to grant it. 30 years ago, she began, her voice carrying quiet power, I was a junior partner at a firm that had never promoted a black woman beyond associate level. I'd worked twice as hard as my peers, brought in major clients, and still got passed over for partnership track positions that went to men with half my credentials. When I finally complained through official channels, I was told I was being too sensitive, that I wasn't a culture fit, that perhaps I'd be happier somewhere else. Alyssa listened, recognizing the pattern that repeated across industries and generations. Talented people systematically excluded because they didn't match someone's narrow definition of who belonged. I stayed, Lorraine continued, not because I wanted to, but because leaving felt like admitting they were right about me. I endured another 5 years of being overlooked, undervalued, and patronized before finally making partner, by which point I was so exhausted that the victory felt hollow. I've thought about that a lot over the years, how institutions grind down people who are different until either they conform, leave, or break. She paused, her gaze drifting to the memorial plaque visible across the lobby. I've stayed at this hotel for 30 years, business trips, family celebrations, personal retreats. And in those 30 years, I've been followed by security, questioned about my ability to pay, asked if I was lost when heading to the executive lounge, and treated with suspicion by staff who assumed someone like me didn't belong in a place like this. I never complained. I just accepted it as the cost of existing in spaces that weren't designed for me. Ms. Mitchell, I'm so deeply sorry that you experienced... Let me finish, please. Lorraine's voice was gentle, but firm. I watched what happened to you 6 months ago. I watched you respond not with revenge, but with systematic reform. I've watched the changes you've implemented, the resistance you've faced, the courage you've shown, and I needed to tell you something before your board potentially votes away your authority. What you're doing matters more than you probably realize. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded newspaper article, The paper warned from repeated handling. This is from yesterday's Chicago Tribune, an editorial arguing that your reforms are unnecessary political correctness that prioritizes feelings over business reality. The author is a man who's never been discriminated against in his life, who's never had to calculate whether his dignity was worth risking his livelihood, who's never understood that what he experiences as minor inconvenience others experience as systematic exclusion. Lorraine refolded the article with precise care. Your board will likely present this kind of thinking as pragmatic business sense. They'll tell you that market forces demand efficiency and that dignity is expensive. They'll frame resistance to change as rational skepticism rather than as protection of privilege. And you need to be prepared to counter that not just with data, but with moral clarity about what kind of institutions we're building and who they're designed to serve. You flew here to tell me this? I drove. I live in Evanston. But yes, I came specifically to tell you this before your board meeting, because I've watched too many good people compromise their values when facing institutional pressure, and I've seen how those compromises accumulate until suddenly you're defending systems you once wanted to dismantle. She stood slowly, her dignity absolute despite her physical limitations. Don't let them grind you down the way my firm ground me down. Don't accept their framing that reform is optional or excessive. Keep pushing, even when it's expensive and exhausting, and everyone's telling you to be reasonable. Alyssa stood as well, moved by the unexpected gift of this woman's time and wisdom. Thank you. I promise I won't waste this. Good. Now I'm going to check in for my reservation. I specifically requested this hotel because I wanted to support what you're doing. I hope by the time I check out, you're still the one doing it. She walked toward the front desk with measured steps, leaving Alyssa standing in the lobby processing the encounter. This was what transformation meant in practice, not abstract policy changes, but concrete impacts on real people who'd spent decades navigating systems designed to exclude them. Lorraine Mitchell had endured 30 years of indignity at this hotel, not because she lacked alternatives, but because she'd learned to accept discrimination as inevitable. And now she was actively choosing to return because someone had finally said that acceptance was no longer required. The board call began exactly on time, 9 faces arranged in video conference windows with expressions ranging from supportive to hostile. Richard Westwood occupied the center frame, his positioning deliberate and his expression suggesting he'd already secured enough votes to prevail. Alyssa joined from the hotel's executive office, Patricia beside her monitoring chat feeds and backup data. Let's begin, Westwood said, his voice carrying the false civility that barely masked anticipation of victory. We're here to review 6 months of operational data under Ms. Grant's reform initiatives and determine whether those initiatives should continue, be modified, or be discontinued entirely. Alyssa, you have 30 minutes to present your case. She pulled up her presentation, leading with the data that would make everyone uncomfortable. 6 months ago, I committed to transforming institutional culture across our portfolio. That transformation has cost $41 million and has resulted in 7% revenue decline compared to industry averages. Employee turnover has dropped 43%. Guest satisfaction has increased 12% overall. And we've had 0 discrimination incidents that resulted in viral media coverage, lawsuits, or regulatory complaints. She clicked through slides showing the breakdown, training costs, facility improvements, compensation adjustments, external auditing fees. Each line item represented money that could have been distributed as dividends or reinvested in expansion. Each line item was also evidence of commitment to promises made. However, she continued, revenue decline isn't uniform across demographics. We've lost high-spending guests who explicitly preferred our previous approach. We've gained guests who specifically choose us because of our reforms. The net result is lower immediate revenue, but a customer base that's younger, more diverse, and more likely to demonstrate long-term loyalty based on values alignment rather than just amenity quality. Westwood interrupted before she could continue. So we've exchanged profitable guests for ideologically aligned guests. That's not a business strategy, that's activism disguised as management. It's positioning for demographic shifts that are inevitable whether we acknowledge them or not. In 10 years, the luxury travel market will be dominated by people under 50 who prioritize corporate values in purchasing decisions. We're building relationships with those customers now, while competitors continue serving markets that are literally aging out. Catherine Mercer spoke up, her tone skeptical but not hostile. The data supports that interpretation, but it also shows we're taking significant risk by alienating existing high-value customers. What happens if your projected demographic shifts don't materialize as quickly as anticipated? We've spent $40 million betting on a future that might not arrive fast enough to justify the investment. We've spent $40 million ensuring we don't face catastrophic brand failure when the next discrimination incident goes viral. Because make no mistake, without these reforms, another incident was inevitable, and the next one might not feature the owner as victim, which means instead of controlling the narrative, we'd be defending the indefensible. Alyssa pulled up the surveillance footage compilation she'd shown 6 months ago. Every property in our portfolio had patterns like this. We were one phone video away from systematic brand destruction. Reform wasn't optional, it was survival. James Park nodded thoughtfully. I agree the reforms were necessary, but could they have been implemented more gradually to reduce financial impact? Gradual implementation signals lack of commitment. It tells employees we're not serious about change, which undermines cultural transformation. It tells guests we're managing optics rather than fixing problems, which erodes trust. And it increases the window during which another major incident could occur. She clicked to a new slide showing implementation timeline analysis. Rapid comprehensive reform cost more initially, but generated faster cultural adoption and reduced risk exposure significantly. The debate continued for 90 minutes, board members probing every assumption and challenging every projection. Westwood hammered on the revenue decline, framing it as proof that principals were expensive luxuries the market wouldn't support. Catherine Mercer worried about investor relations and potential shareholder activism. Even supportive board members expressed concern about sustainability if financial trends continued. Finally, Westwood moved to close. I appreciate Alyssa's passion, but passion doesn't pay dividends. I'm calling for a vote to suspend the reform initiatives pending comprehensive independent review of their financial viability. We can revisit after the review, but for now we need to stop hemorrhaging revenue to fund programs that our core customer base explicitly opposes. Before we vote, Alyssa said, her voice cutting through the building consensus, I want to share something that happened this morning. She pulled up a new presentation. Not data she'd planned to show, but something she'd been compiling over the past 6 months. Letters from guests. Not the complaint letters about political correctness, but the other letters. The ones from people who'd experienced discrimination and finally felt seen. A South Asian businessman who'd been followed by security at 3 different luxury hotels before staying at theirs without incident. A Black family who'd been questioned about their reservation at every property they'd visited until finding one that welcomed them without suspicion. A trans woman who'd been humiliated at check-in desks across the country before finally being treated with dignity at a hotel that trained staff on inclusive practices. These people, Alyssa said quietly, represent a market we've been systematically excluding, not through explicit policy, but through cultural practices that communicated they weren't wanted. We've spent decades optimizing our business for people who look and sound and move through the world in specific ways, and we've treated everyone else as risk to be managed rather than guests to be served. She clicked through more letters, each one a story of exclusion transformed into inclusion. The revenue we're losing? It's coming from people who preferred a world where they never had to encounter difference, where their comfort was prioritized over everyone else's dignity. The revenue we're gaining is coming from people who've been waiting for institutions to evolve. And yes, that exchange is currently net negative, but it's building a foundation that will outlast any quarterly earnings report. Westwood leaned forward, his patience clearly exhausted. That's a beautiful sentiment, Alyssa. But sentiment doesn't satisfy fiduciary duty. We have an obligation to maximize shareholder value, and your reforms are failing that obligation. I'm calling the vote. Actually, a new voice interrupted, you're not. Everyone turned to the video window where Lorraine Mitchell's face had appeared, her expression combining legal authority with personal determination. Patricia looked confused, but Alyssa felt understanding click into place. Ms. Mitchell? Catherine Mercer sounded equally confused. I didn't realize you were joining this call. James invited me as an observer given my background in corporate law and my long history with this property. I've been listening to this debate for 90 minutes, and I need to say something before you vote. Westwood's face had gone carefully blank. With respect, this is a closed board session. With respect, Richard, I'm also one of your largest investors. I control 6% of Grant Capital Holdings through various trusts and investment vehicles. James can confirm. She waited while James pulled up shareholder records and nodded confirmation. So I have standing to participate in this discussion, and what I have to say is simple. If you vote to suspend Alyssa's reforms, I'll divest completely, and I'll make sure every media outlet knows exactly why. The silence was absolute. 6% wasn't controlling interest, but it was significant enough that public divestment would trigger panic among other investors and likely tank the stock price. Furthermore, Lorraine continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades in boardrooms and knew exactly how power operated. I'll contact every investor I know in the socially conscious investment community and recommend they short your stock on grounds that you're prioritizing outdated business models over sustainable positioning. You're worried about 7% revenue decline? Wait until you see what happens when ESG funds start dumping your shares because you've publicly rejected equity initiatives. Westwood's composure was cracking. This is blackmail. This is shareholder activism. I'm exercising my right to influence corporate direction in ways that align with my values. You've spent this entire meeting framing reform as expensive idealism. I'm reframing it as a central strategy that I'm willing to support with my capital. She paused, letting the threat sink in. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to table this vote. You're going to give Alyssa another 6 months to demonstrate whether the demographic shift she's betting on materializes. And if you don't, I'm going to make sure suspending these reforms becomes the most expensive decision this board ever makes. Catherine Mercer was staring at Lorraine with something approaching awe. You're willing to risk significant financial loss to support reforms at a hotel chain? I'm willing to risk financial loss to support the principle that institutions can change. I've spent my entire career watching boards prioritize comfort over courage, and I'm done accepting that as inevitable. Alyssa is trying to build something different. I'm going to help her do it, and anyone who wants to stop her needs to be prepared for the consequences. The board call descended into chaos, multiple people trying to speak at once, Westwood demanding procedural challenges, James Park pulling up bylaws to determine Lorraine's exact rights as observer versus participant. But through the noise, Alyssa watched Catherine Mercer's expression shift from skepticism to calculation, to something approaching respect. Richard, Catherine said, cutting through the confusion, I'm changing my position. I vote to continue the reforms for another 6 months, not because I'm convinced they'll succeed, but because Lorraine's right that suspending them now would be more damaging than continuing. And because she paused, seeming to weigh her words, because I'm tired of boards that only value innovation when it's technological. Cultural innovation matters too, and maybe it's worth the risk. Other board members followed. The coalition Westwood had built crumbling as people recalculated political and financial costs. By the time the formal vote occurred, only Westwood and 2 others opposed continuing reforms. Alyssa had won, not through her presentation alone, but through an unexpected ally who'd recognized that some battles required people with power and resources to actually use them. The call ended with Westwood disconnecting abruptly, his video window going black with barely suppressed fury. The remaining board members dispersed with varying levels of enthusiasm, leaving Alyssa staring at Lorraine's face on the screen. You didn't have to do that, Alyssa said quietly. You risked significant capital to support reforms at a hotel chain. That's what power is for, Lorraine interrupted gently. I spent decades accumulating resources while accepting systems I knew were broken. I'm too old to keep pretending that's acceptable. You're trying to fix something that needs fixing. I have resources that can help. It's not complicated. It's extraordinary. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just keep doing the work, and call me when you face the next crisis, because there will be one. Systems don't transform smoothly. They resist and push back and test your commitment. When that happens, you'll need people who understand the stakes and won't flinch when the cost gets high. The screen went dark, leaving Alyssa and Patricia alone in the office. For a long moment, neither spoke, processing what had just happened. Then Patricia laughed, a slightly hysterical sound that mixed relief and disbelief. Did we just win because a 70-year-old retired lawyer threatened to tank our stock price? We won because someone with power decided that protecting her comfort mattered less than supporting change. That's, Alyssa paused, searching for words adequate to the moment. That's actually what transformation requires. Not just victims demanding justice, but people with privilege choosing to redistribute it. Over the following months, the reforms that had seemed so precarious began to stabilize. Revenue decline slowed and then reversed as the demographic shift Alyssa had predicted started materializing faster than even optimistic projections suggested. Hotels that had seemed risky investments became destination properties for travelers who explicitly sought out businesses that prioritized inclusion. Staff retention continued improving, which translated directly to service quality that guests noticed and rewarded with loyalty. But the real transformation was less visible in metrics and more apparent in accumulated small moments. The housekeeper who reported harassment and saw her complaint result in a guest being asked to leave. The security guard who questioned a manager's discriminatory order and was supported rather than punished. The front desk clerk who greeted every guest with the same warmth regardless of their appearance. The maintenance worker who suggested a facility improvement and had management actually implement it. These moments didn't generate headlines or appear in quarterly reports, but they represented something more valuable than revenue. The slow accumulation of dignity into institutional culture, the way repeated actions became normalized. Practices became unquestioned values. The hotel was becoming something different, not perfect, not free from problems, but genuinely committed to treating everyone who entered with respect that wasn't conditional on appearance or status. 9 months after the incident that had changed everything, Alyssa stood in the lobby late one evening, watching the space function with the kind of effortless competence that only emerged from genuine cultural health. Sarah moved between the front desk and guest interactions with confidence that had been unimaginable when she was terrified of contradicting Marcus. Jenkins, now leading diversity training across all properties, spoke with a group of new security hires about the difference between protection and intimidation. Patricia coordinated operations with the easy authority of someone who knew her judgment was trusted. And on the marble floor where her credit card had been destroyed, the memorial plaque gleamed under lights that never dimmed. People stopped to read it regularly. Some guests, some staff, some random passers-by who'd heard the story and wanted to see the physical reminder that institutions could acknowledge failures and commit to better futures. Lorraine Mitchell emerged from the elevators, having checked out of her room and preparing to head home. She saw Alyssa and altered her path, approaching with the careful steps of someone conserving energy but determined to make the effort. "I'm leaving in the morning, but I wanted to say goodbye, and to tell you that I've stayed at this hotel more times in the past 9 months than in the previous 5 years combined. Your reforms didn't just change policy, they changed whether I feel safe here. That's not a small thing. I'm glad, and I'm grateful you were willing to risk so much to support the work." Lorraine smiled, her eyes bright with something that looked like hope tempered by experience. "I didn't risk anything I couldn't afford to lose. That's the advantage of being old and financially secure. I can take stands that younger people can't afford. The real risk was yours. You put your career and reputation on the line for principle. That's rare. I didn't have a choice. After experiencing what I experienced, how could I not act?" Many people would have found ways not to act, would have accepted apologies and moved on, would have implemented minimal changes that look good without costing much, would have protected their position rather than their values. You didn't. That's why I supported you. She paused, glancing around the lobby with something approaching satisfaction. This place feels different now, not just in policy, but in atmosphere. People move differently when they're not constantly calculating whether they belong. That's what dignity looks like when it's embedded in systems rather than granted conditionally. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the lobby function with the kind of inclusive efficiency that had seemed impossible 9 months ago. Then Lorraine squeezed Alyssa's arm gently and headed toward the exit, leaving her standing alone in a space that had been transformed by crisis into something genuinely better. Patricia approached with a tablet, her expression combining satisfaction and exhaustion. Latest numbers just came in. Revenue is now 3% above pre-reform baseline. Employee satisfaction scores are the highest we've recorded. And we just got confirmation that we've been certified as a leader in inclusive hospitality practices by 3 major industry organizations. The reforms worked, Alyssa. They actually worked. Alyssa accepted the tablet, scanning data that represented 9 months of difficult, expensive, exhausting transformation. The numbers were good, but they weren't what mattered most. What mattered was that when someone in worn sneakers walked into this lobby now, they'd be greeted with respect rather than suspicion. What mattered was that employees felt safe reporting problems without fearing retaliation. What mattered was that power had been used not to protect itself, but to dismantle systems that had caused harm while everyone looked away. It worked, she agreed quietly, but this isn't the end. It's just proof that transformation is possible when people commit to it. Now we need to make sure it lasts, that 5 years from now, when media attention is faded and I'm no longer personally overseeing every detail, these practices are so embedded that no one can dismantle them without everyone noticing. How do we do that? We keep doing what we've been doing. We keep listening to people who experience these systems from below. We keep holding leadership accountable. We keep choosing dignity over convenience, even when it's expensive and complicated. We make transformation boring, routine rather than exceptional, expected rather than surprising. Patricia nodded slowly, understanding settling across her features. Make revolution into standard practice. Exactly. The real victory isn't winning once. It's building systems that keep winning even when the original crisis that sparked change has been forgotten. They stood together in the lobby, 2 women who'd been changed by 6 months of crisis and transformation, watching a space that had been broken begin to function as it should have all along. Outside, Chicago continued its indifferent progress. Millions of people navigating systems that worked for some and failed others. Institutions that changed glacially, if at all. Power structures that protected themselves until forced to evolve. But in this one building, on this one night, something different was happening. Not perfection. There would be setbacks and complications and moments when old patterns reasserted themselves. But genuine progress toward a version of hospitality that actually honored everyone it claimed to serve. The memorial plaque caught light from passing guests, its message simple and permanent. Dignity is not optional. Those 4 words had been tested repeatedly over 9 months, by guests who demanded special treatment, by employees who preferred old hierarchies, by board members who prioritized profit over principle. Each time, the institution had chosen to uphold the commitment those words represented. Each time, the culture had grown slightly stronger, slightly more resistant to the forces that preferred convenience over justice. Alyssa checked her watch. 11:47 p.m., the exact time she'd been thrown out of this lobby 9 months ago. The symmetry was unintentional but meaningful. 9 months of gestation had birthed something new, not a perfect institution, but one genuinely committed to becoming better. Her phone buzzed with a message from Evelyn Torres, the woman who'd called weeks ago to tell her that people were watching. Saw the news about your certifications. Congratulations on proving that change is possible. My lawsuit is being dropped, not because you paid me off, but because I've watched you actually fix what was broken. That's rare. Don't stop. Alyssa smiled, typing back a brief thank you before pocketing her phone. The lobby was beginning to quiet as night deepened, guests retiring to rooms and staff transitioning to overnight operations. In a few hours, Sarah would begin her shift, navigating challenges with the confidence of someone who knew her judgment mattered. Security would patrol with the understanding that their job was protecting everyone, not just people who looked like they belonged. Housekeepers would arrive knowing that complaints would be heard and harassers would face consequences. It wasn't the dramatic ending that viral moments seemed to promise. No single climactic confrontation, no theatrical justice, no perfectly resolved narrative. Just the slow, difficult, expensive work of changing culture, one decision at a time, one policy at a time, one person at a time. Just the commitment to keep choosing dignity when convenience would be easier, to keep redistributing power when hoarding it would be more comfortable, to keep transforming systems until the transformation became so embedded that reverting seemed impossible. Patricia left to finalize evening operations, leaving Alyssa alone in the lobby she'd once been thrown out of and now had transformed. She walked to the memorial plaque, running her fingers over bronze letters that would outlast trends and leadership changes and quarterly earnings pressures. This plaque was her promise made permanent, a reminder to herself and everyone else that some things mattered more than metrics, that institutions could choose humanity over habit, that power was worthless unless wielded with purpose. Somewhere in the building, Lorraine Mitchell was packing for her morning departure, satisfied that her investment in justice had generated returns no spreadsheet could measure. Somewhere beyond the building, other hotels continued operating with the same discriminatory practices that had nearly destroyed this one. Their leadership convinced that change was too expensive or unnecessary or impossible. And somewhere in between those realities, hundreds of employees and thousands of guests were learning that dignity didn't have to be negotiated, that respect could be standard practice, that institutions could evolve when people with power decided comfort mattered less than correctness. Alyssa took the elevator to the penthouse, exhaustion and satisfaction mixing into something that felt like peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. It always did. But tonight, she could rest knowing that the woman in worn sneakers who'd been humiliated 9 months ago had used that humiliation to change everything. That crisis had become catalyst. That one viral moment of injustice had sparked transformation that would outlast the video, the headlines, the social media debates. She'd walked into this lobby as a victim and walked out as a revolutionary who understood that true power wasn't crushing enemies, but dismantling systems that created enemies in the first place. And as she settled into sleep, the city lights painting geometric patterns across penthouse walls, Alyssa Grant allowed herself to believe something dangerous and necessary, that change was possible, that justice could be systematic rather than exceptional, that dignity could become default rather than privilege. The memorial plaque gleamed in the lobby below, its message simple and permanent. And in rooms and corridors throughout the building, people moved through space differently than they had 9 months ago, with the confidence that came from institutional commitment to their worth, with the dignity that emerged when power chose service over dominance. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. And sometimes in institutions designed to resist change, better was revolutionary enough.